The scattering of the Primarchs stands as perhaps the most pivotal moment in Imperial history, a catastrophe engineered by the ruinous powers that forever altered the Emperor's grand design. While the full truth of what occurred in the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains remains shrouded in secrecy, what is known with certainty is that the nascent Primarchs, still developing in their gestation pods, were seized by a warp storm of unprecedented magnitude and cast into the Imperium. Horus Lupercal, who would one day bear the title of Warmaster, was hurled through the screaming tides of the warp like his brothers. The Chaos Gods, recognizing the potential within the Emperor's creations, sought to corrupt them before they could fulfill their intended purpose. Yet fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, guided Horus's pod to Thonia, a world so close to Terra that some Imperial scholars debate whether it was truly a separate planet at all or merely a moon or planetoid captured by Terra's gravitational pull millennia earlier. Thonia was no paradise. By the time of Horus's arrival in the late 29th millennium, the world had been mined for resources for so long that its surface was a honeycomb of tunnels and shafts, its population living in sprawling underground warrens. The planet's society had devolved into a brutal existence where gang warfare and survival of the strongest were the only constants. The atmosphere was thick with industrial pollutants, the sky perpetually overcast with toxic clouds that rarely allowed the light of Sol to penetrate to the surface. It was into this harsh environment that the infant Primarch emerged from his gestation pod. Unlike some of his brothers who were adopted by ruling families or discovered by learned men, Horus's early years were spent in the brutal gang hierarchies of Thonia. The records of this time are fragmentary at best, deliberately obscured at worst. Some accounts suggest he rose quickly through the ranks of one of the planet's most feared gangs, while others claim he formed his own warband from disparate outcasts. What remains consistent in all tellings is that by adolescence, Horus had already demonstrated the tactical acumen and leadership qualities that would later define him. The Emperor's discovery of Horus came during the final stages of the unification wars on Terra, as the Master of Mankind consolidated his control over humanity's birthworld. His psychic awareness detected something extraordinary on nearby Thonia. Some accounts suggest the Emperor had always known where Horus had landed and had simply waited for the right moment to retrieve him. Others claim it was only after securing Terra that the Emperor's psychic might could be directed outward to locate his scattered sons. The meeting between Creator and creation was momentous. Horus, by then a young man hardened by Thonia's merciless environment, encountered a being whose presence and power transcended anything he had ever known. The Emperor recognized in Horus not just the genetic perfection he had engineered, but a keen intellect and charismatic presence that set him apart even from what he had intended. For Horus, the encounter answered questions of origin and purpose that had likely haunted him since consciousness. As the first Primarch to be recovered, Horus enjoyed a unique relationship with the Emperor. While his brothers would later be discovered as fully formed leaders, already shaped by their adoptive cultures, Horus had the privilege of direct tutelage under the Master of Mankind during humanity's most crucial expansion. The Emperor personally instructed Horus in warfare, statecraft, and the imperial truth, the secular, rationalist philosophy that underpinned the nascent Imperium. During the later stages of the Unification Wars, Horus stood at the Emperor's side as the remaining holdouts on Terra were brought to compliance. He witnessed firsthand the diplomatic finesse with which some were incorporated and the overwhelming force used against others. These lessons in the application of both soft and hard power would serve Horus well in the Great Crusade to come. When the Emperor's gaze turned beyond Terra to Luna and the wider Sol system, Horus was there to observe and learn. The pacification of Luna's gene cults provided Horus with his first taste of void warfare and the challenges of conquering established human colonies. The Emperor's approach to these campaigns, offering compliance before conquest, but delivering absolute destruction when defied, became a template that Horus would later employ with devastating effectiveness. Physically, Horus was the embodiment of what a Primarch was meant to be. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, his physique combined overwhelming strength with a fluid grace that belied his massive frame. His features were striking rather than conventionally handsome, a high forehead, aquiline nose, and penetrating eyes that seemed to shift between gray and amber depending on his mood. His skin bore the pallor common to Chthonians, contrasting with his close, cropped black hair. When he smiled, which was often in those early days, there was a genuine warmth that could win over the most skeptical allies. Yet it was not merely Horus's physical attributes that set him apart. His intellect operated on multiple levels simultaneously, able to process battlefield data, diplomatic nuances, and logistical concerns with equal facility. His memory was flawless, recalling conversations verbatim years after they occurred and recognizing faces of soldiers he had met only briefly among thousands. Perhaps most remarkably, Horus possessed an empathic understanding of human psychology that allowed him to inspire unquestioning loyalty in those who served him. This combination of physical prowess, intellectual brilliance, and emotional intelligence made Horus uniquely suited to command. The Emperor recognized this early, entrusting him with increasing responsibility as the Great Crusade began in earnest around the year 798 of the 30th millennium. While the Emperor had created all the Primarchs with specific roles in mind, Horus seemed capable of fulfilling almost any function required. He was a peerless warrior, a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader, and a skilled diplomat, the complete package in a way that even his brothers, each exceptional in their own right, were not. The early years of the Great Crusade saw Horus commanding expeditionary fleets alongside the Emperor himself. These campaigns served as practical education in the art of bringing human worlds into compliance. Horus observed how the Emperor would first offer peaceful integration into the Imperium, with all the benefits of protection and technological advancement that entailed. He learned when to deploy remembrancers to document a world's culture before integration, when to use iterators to persuade through rhetoric, and when the situation called for the unleashing of transhuman warriors. When the Luna Wolves Legion was formally united with their Primarch around the year 800 of the 30th millennium, the bond was immediate and profound. Gene forged from Horus's own genetic template, the Astartes of the 16th Legion recognized in him the physical embodiment of their own potential. For Horus, the Legion represented an extension of his will, warriors who could execute his vision of warfare with superhuman efficiency. Under Horus's leadership, the Luna Wolves quickly established themselves as one of the most effective instruments of Imperial expansion. Their approach to warfare reflected their Primarchs' balanced perspective, flexible, adaptable, and pragmatic. Where some legions became known for particular specialties or doctrines, the Luna Wolves excelled at rapidly assessing each theater of war and deploying the optimal strategy for the situation at hand. The signature tactic that emerged during these early campaigns was the Speardip, a concentrated assault by elite elements directly targeting an enemy's command structure. Horus recognized that many human civilizations, particularly those that had regressed during the Age of Strife, relied heavily on centralized leadership. By decapitating this leadership in swift, overwhelming strikes, the Luna Wolves could often bring compliance without protracted conflict. This approach minimized casualties on both sides and preserved infrastructure valuable to the Imperium, a consideration that demonstrated Horus's strategic foresight. As the Great Crusade expanded and accelerated, the Emperor began to delegate more authority to his son. Increasingly, Horus commanded not just his own legion, but multi-legion expeditionary forces, coordinating the efforts of his brother Primarchs as they were discovered and brought into the Imperial fold. This role as first among equals was a natural extension of his status as the Emperor's most trusted son, but it also reflected his genuine talent for managing the often conflicting personalities and doctrines of his brothers and their legions. The relationship between Horus and the Emperor during this period was one of mentor and protege, father and son, sovereign and heir apparent. They would spend long hours in private consultation, discussing not just military matters, but the philosophical underpinnings of the Imperium they were building. The Emperor shared with Horus his vision of a united human galaxy, free from the superstition and ignorance that had characterized the Age of Strife. Horus, in turn, offered perspectives informed by his direct engagement with the myriad human cultures encountered during the Crusade. This close relationship fostered in Horus a deep understanding of the Emperor's grand design, but it also created expectations. As the first found Primarch, as the Emperor's right hand during the formative years of the Imperium, Horus came to see himself as special among his brothers, not merely first among equals, but the true inheritor of the Emperor's vision. This perception, while not entirely unfounded given his unique position, contained within it the seeds of the tragedy that would later unfold. As more Primarchs were discovered and brought into the Imperial fold, Horus's role evolved. He became the bridge between the Emperor and his brothers, helping to integrate these demigods into the hierarchy of the Imperium. For Primarchs like Rogel Dorn, Ferrus Manus, and Robute Guilliman, who had ruled their own worlds before the Emperor's arrival, the transition to serving under another's authority could be challenging. Horus's diplomatic skills proved invaluable in smoothing these transitions, explaining the Emperor's vision in terms each Primarch could relate to and appreciate. The 16th Legion was created alongside its brother legions in the gene laboratories of Terra, drawing its initial recruits from the techno-barbarian tribes that roamed the rad wastes of the Terran continent once known as Germani. These first warriors were hard men, raised in the constant warfare that had engulfed Terra during the Age of Strife. They were selected for their aggression, resilience, and capacity for violence, traits that would come to define the Legion's approach to warfare even before their Primarch's discovery. During the Unification Wars, the 16th Legion earned a fearsome reputation for brutal efficiency. Unlike some of their brother legions who developed specialized combat doctrines early in their existence, these warriors were generalists, adaptable soldiers who could be deployed in any theater of war with devastating effect. Their early campaigns on Terra saw them tasked with breaking the most stubborn resistance to the Emperor's rule, particularly among the techno-barbarian states that refused diplomatic overtures. The Emperor named them the Luna Wolves after the successful pacification of Luna, where the 16th fought alongside other early Legion formations to bring the gene cults to compliance. This naming recognized both their ferocity in battle and their role as the Emperor's executioners when more peaceful means failed. The image of the wolf, a pack hunter that strikes with coordinated precision, became central to their identity, informing both their heraldry and their tactical approach. When Horus took command of his gene sons around 800, the Legion underwent a transformation that built upon their existing strengths while refining their approach to warfare. The Terran veterans who formed the Legion's core found in their Primarch a leader who embodied their martial values while elevating them with strategic sophistication. Horus immediately recognized the potential in these warriors and set about molding them into an extension of his will. One of Horus's first acts was to incorporate recruits from his homeworld of Thonia. These gangers brought with them a different kind of combat experience. They were survivors of the brutal tunnel wars that raged through Thonia's honeycomb interior, fighters who understood close quarters combat and the psychological aspects of warfare. The integration of Thonian recruits with Terran veterans created a unique warrior culture within the Legion, blending the disciplined professionalism of the Unification Wars veterans with the savage pragmatism of the Thonian gangers. This cultural fusion manifested in the Legion's appearance and customs. While maintaining the Emperor's standardized armor patterns, Luna Wolves often incorporated personal trophies and kill markings, particularly after notable victories. Many shaved their heads in the Thonian style, while others adopted facial scarification patterns that denoted their gang origins. These practices were tolerated and even encouraged by Horus, who understood the importance of warrior traditions in building Legion identity. The organizational structure of the Luna Wolves reflected Horus's emphasis on flexibility and rapid response. While nominally adhering to the Principia Bellicosa that governed all Space Marine legions, Horus frequently reorganized his forces based on operational requirements. Companies could be temporarily consolidated or split apart, with command structures adjusted to suit the mission parameters. This fluidity allowed the Luna Wolves to adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions, a significant advantage during the unpredictable encounters of the Great Crusade. At the heart of the Legion's command structure was the Mournival, a unique advisory body consisting of 4 captains who represented different aspects of the Legion's character. Neither an official rank nor a formal institution, the Mournival served as Horus's inner circle, offering perspectives that helped the Primarch make balanced decisions. The four members traditionally embodied different temperaments: the diplomat, the traditionalist, the progressive, and the warrior. Through their council, Horus gained insight into how his commands would be received by different factions within the Legion. First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon stood as the most prominent figure in the Legion after Horus himself. Born on Thonia and recruited in the early waves of inductees following Horus's discovery, Abaddon rose through the ranks through a combination of martial prowess and absolute loyalty to his Primarch. As commander of the First Company, the elite Justarin Terminator Squad, Abaddon often led the spirited assaults that became the Legion's signature tactic. His temperament was that of the warrior in the Mournival, direct and aggressive, advocating for decisive action in all matters. Physically, Abaddon was imposing even by Astartes standards. Broad-shouldered and bull-necked, with a perpetual scowl beneath his topknot of black hair, his presence commanded respect and often fear. His weapon of choice, the power Maul Worldbreaker, became infamous for the devastation it wreaked on the battlefield. Abaddon's relationship with Horus transcended the typical bond between Primarch and Astartes. There was a genuine filial affection between them, with Abaddon viewing Horus not just as his commander, but as a father figure worthy of emulation. Captain Garville Loken represented a different aspect of the Legion's character. A later recruit from Thonia, Loken rose to prominence through his thoughtful approach to warfare and his questioning nature. Where Abaddon embodied the Legion's aggression, Loken represented its capacity for reflection. His elevation to the Mournival came after the Whisperhead campaign, where his tactical insights proved decisive in breaking a deadlock that had stalled the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet. Loken commanded the 10th Company with a methodical efficiency that complemented the more aggressive elements of the Legion. His warriors were known for their disciplined fire patterns and coordinated maneuvers, often serving as the anvil to the Justarin's hammer. Within the Mournival, Loken typically assumed the role of the progressive voice, willing to consider new approaches and question established doctrines when circumstances warranted. Completing the Mournival during the later stages of the Great Crusade were Captains Tarek Torgadin and Horus Aximand. Torgadin, commanding the Second Company, was renowned for his dark humor and psychological warfare tactics. His units specialized in breaking enemy morale through a combination of terror tactics and precisely targeted strikes. Despite his fearsome reputation on the battlefield, Torgadin was known within the Legion for his camaraderie and wit, serving as the diplomat who could diffuse tensions between competing factions. Horus Aximand, called Little Horus for his uncanny resemblance to the Primarch, led the Fifth Company with a scholarly attention to detail. A student of military history, Aximand often incorporated lessons from past campaigns into his tactical planning. His company became adept at complex maneuvers that required precise timing and coordination. Within the Mournival, Aximand typically represented the traditionalist perspective, advocating for approaches that had proven successful in the past. The combat doctrine of the Luna Wolves centered on the concept of overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. While some legions like the Ultramarines emphasized balanced warfare across all phases of combat, and others like the White Scars specialized in particular aspects of war, the Luna Wolves focused on identifying and exploiting the critical weakness in any enemy force. This approach was encapsulated in their battle cry, "Kill for the living, kill for the dead." The spirited assault represented the purest expression of this philosophy. Rather than engaging in protracted warfare across multiple fronts, the Luna Wolves would analyze enemy force disposition to identify command nodes, then deploy elite units in concentrated strikes to eliminate these targets. First Captain Abaddon's Justarin Terminators typically formed the tip of the spear, teleporting or drop-podding directly into enemy command centers to decapitate the opposition's leadership. This tactic proved devastatingly effective against human civilizations encountered during the Great Crusade. On Dahinta, the Luna Wolves ended a 3-year conflict in a single day by eliminating the ruling council that had rejected Imperial compliance. On Attica Prime, the death of a warlord king at Abaddon's hands led to the immediate surrender of forces that had previously vowed to fight to the last man. The Luna Wolves' approach to warfare was not merely about battlefield victories, but about the efficient expansion of the Imperium. By targeting leadership structures rather than engaging in wars of attrition, they preserved infrastructure and populations that could be integrated into the Imperial fold. This efficiency made them particularly valuable during the middle phases of the Great Crusade, when the pace of expansion was at its height. The Legion's reputation grew with each successful campaign, attracting attention from both allies and potential enemies. Other Primarchs studied the Luna Wolves' methods, with some like Ferrus Manus and Leman Russ adopting elements of their approach. Even the normally doctrinaire Robute Guilliman acknowledged the effectiveness of the Spirit tactic, though he questioned its long-term impact on conquered populations. Among the most notable campaigns of the Luna Wolves during the Great Crusade was the compliance of 6319. This human civilization had achieved a high level of technological development during the Age of Strife, creating a formidable defensive network that had repelled previous Imperial expeditions. The Luna Wolves, operating as part of the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, deployed their full array of tactics against this stubborn foe. The campaign began with diplomatic overtures, as was standard Imperial protocol. When these were rejected, Horus authorized a multi-phase assault that demonstrated the Legion's adaptability. Initial void engagements neutralized orbital defenses, allowing for the deployment of reconnaissance units to identify key targets. Once the planetary command structure was mapped, Justaran Terminators teleported directly into the central governance complex, while diversionary forces engaged defensive units elsewhere. The speed and precision of the attack left the leadership of 6319 no time to implement contingency plans. Within 6 hours of the initial assault, the primary resistance had been broken, and within 3 days, the entire system had been brought to compliance. This efficiency impressed even the Emperor, who commended Horus for preserving both the population and the technological infrastructure that made the system valuable to the Imperium. Another showcase of Luna Wolves' tactics came during the Ulanor campaign against the Orc Empire of Warlord Erlak Erg. The scale of this Xenos threat required a multi-legion response, with the Luna Wolves fighting alongside the White Scars, Ultramarines, and several other legions. Despite the combined Imperial force numbering in the millions, it was the Luna Wolves' decapitation strike that proved decisive. Horus personally led an assault on Erlak Erg's command center, cutting through layers of Orc defenders to reach the warlord himself. The subsequent duel between Primarch and Warboss became legendary, with Horus emerging victorious despite sustaining wounds that would have killed a lesser being. With their leader slain by the Lupercal himself, the Orc forces fell into disarray, allowing the Imperial forces to systematically eliminate resistance across the planet. The victory at Ulanor represented the pinnacle of the Luna Wolves' achievements during the Great Crusade. It was in the aftermath of this campaign that the Emperor made the momentous decision to elevate Horus to the rank of Warmaster, placing him in command of all Imperial military forces, while the Emperor himself returned to Terra. This promotion recognized not just Horus's personal capabilities, but the effectiveness of his legion in executing the Emperor's vision of conquest. The Ulanor Crusade stands as perhaps the most significant military campaign of the Great Crusade era, a massive undertaking that would not only shape the future of the Imperium, but forever alter the trajectory of Horus Lupercal's life. The scale of the Orc Empire that had risen under Warlord Erlak Erg defied conventional Imperial assessment. Intelligence gathered by rogue traders and advanced scout elements indicated that Erg had united hundreds of worlds under his control, creating a Xenos domain that threatened to destabilize an entire sector of the expanding Imperium. The Orc Empire of Ulanor represented a different kind of threat than many encountered during the Great Crusade. Unlike human civilizations that might be brought to compliance through diplomacy or targeted strikes, the Orcs of Ulanor had created a genuine war machine, with industrial capacity rivaling that of Forge worlds and numbers that could overwhelm even Astartes formations through sheer mass. reports indicated that Urlak-Urg had somehow managed to impose a level of organization on the Greenskins that amplified their natural ferocity with uncharacteristic strategic coherence. Recognizing the magnitude of this threat, the Emperor marshaled an unprecedented Imperial force. No fewer than 7 full Space Marine legions were committed to the campaign, including the Luna Wolves, White Scars, Ultramarines, Blood Angels, Imperial Fists, Iron Warriors, and World Eaters. Supporting these transhuman warriors were elements of the Mechanicum, including Titan legions and Skitarii cohorts, alongside hundreds of Imperial army regiments. The war fleet assembled in the staging area near the Ulener sector blotted out the stars, a testament to the Imperium's determination to excise this Xenos cancer from the galaxy. Horus, having already proven his tactical brilliance in countless campaigns, was given operational command of the combined force. The challenge before him was immense, coordinating multiple Primarchs, each with their own combat doctrines and temperaments, while developing a strategy that could efficiently dismantle an empire spanning hundreds of worlds. Lesser commanders might have opted for a war of attrition, gradually pushing back the Orc domains through systematic conquest, but Horus recognized that such an approach would cost millions of lives and potentially years of fighting. Instead, he devised a strategy that played to the unique strengths of each legion while exploiting the hierarchical nature of Orc society. The plan centered on a multi-layered assault that would systematically isolate Urlak-Urg's primary forces while simultaneously striking at his command structure. Jagatai Khan's White Scars would conduct lightning raids against outlying Orc worlds, disrupting supply lines and drawing off reinforcements. Guilliman's Ultramarines would secure key strategic positions, establishing a containment perimeter that prevented the Orcs from consolidating their forces. The Imperial Fists and Iron Warriors would reduce the heavily fortified Orc strongholds that protected approach vectors to the Ulener system itself. This left the Luna Wolves, Blood Angels, and World Eaters as the spearhead for the main assault on Ulener Prime, the heart of the Orc Empire. Horus's plan called for these 3 assault-oriented legions to strike directly at the planetary capital, where intelligence suggested Urlak-Urg had established his throne. The Warmaster's insight was that despite their numbers and newfound organization, the Orcs still operated on a principle of leadership through strength. Remove Urlak-Urg, and the Empire would fragment into competing factions that could be defeated in detail. The initial phases of the campaign unfolded exactly as Horus had envisioned. The White Scars swept through the outer systems like a storm, appearing and disappearing before the Orcs could mount an effective defense. Guilliman's methodical advance secured key junction points in the Orc Empire's crude but effective transportation network. The siege specialists of Dorne and Perturabo reduced Orc fortress worlds one by one, drawing significant enemy forces into desperate but ultimately futile defensive actions. As these operations progressed, Horus gathered intelligence that refined his understanding of the Ulener threat. Prisoners taken during the White Scars raids confirmed that Urlak-Urg had instituted a form of meritocratic advancement among his followers, creating a cadre of surprisingly competent Orc commanders. More concerning were reports that the warlord himself stood apart even from these lieutenants, a massive specimen whose physical and mental capabilities far exceeded the norm for his species. When the moment came for the main assault on Ulener Prime, Horus adjusted his tactics accordingly. Rather than a broad offensive across multiple landing zones, he concentrated his forces on a single massive drop directly into the heart of the Orc capital. This approach, reminiscent of the Luna Wolves' spear-dip tactic, but executed on an unprecedented scale, was designed to overwhelm the Orc defenders through shock and concentrated violence before they could organize an effective response. The drop itself was a masterpiece of void warfare coordination. Thousands of drop pods and assault boats punched through the Orcs' orbital defenses in a precisely timed sequence, creating corridors for the follow-up waves. The World Eaters under Angron struck first, their berserker fury carving out landing zones amid the crude but formidable Orc fortifications. The Blood Angels followed, with Sanguinius leading his sons in a series of devastating aerial assaults that neutralized the Orcs' heavy weapons emplacements. The Luna Wolves formed the third wave, with Horus himself at the forefront, leading his elite Justaran Terminators in a direct thrust toward Erlak Erg's throne complex. The fighting on Ulanor Prime was among the most intense of the entire Great Crusade. The Orcs, sensing the existential threat to their empire, fought with uncharacteristic discipline alongside their typical ferocity. Entire companies of space marines were lost in the maze like warrens of the Orc capital, ambushed by mobs of greenskins who used their intimate knowledge of the terrain to deadly effect. The advance slowed as the Imperial forces encountered increasingly large concentrations of Orc elites, the so-called Nobs and Warbosses who formed Erlak Erg's inner circle. It was at this critical juncture that Horus demonstrated why he was the Emperor's most trusted general. Recognizing that a conventional advance would result in unacceptable casualties, he reorganized his forces on the fly, creating a specialized strike team drawn from elements of all three legions. This composite unit, led by Horus himself and including 1st Captain Abaddon, World Eaters Captain Karn, and Blood Angels Captain Raldoran, would bypass the main Orc defenses using a series of underground maintenance tunnels identified by Luna Wolf's reconnaissance units. The gambit was fraught with risk. The tunnels were barely mapped, potentially leading the strike team into ambushes or dead ends. Separating from the main force meant no ready reinforcements if they encountered serious resistance. Most critically, it placed 3 Legion command structures at risk simultaneously. Yet the potential reward, a direct confrontation with Erlak Erg that could end the campaign in a single stroke, outweighed these concerns in Horus's strategic calculus. The strike team's advance through the tunnels became the stuff of Legion legend. Fighting in cramped conditions against Orc patrols and maintenance crews, the mixed unit of elite Astartes demonstrated the adaptability and lethality that defined the Emperor's transhuman warriors. Abaddon's Justaran Terminators formed the vanguard, their immense bulk and nearly impenetrable armor allowing them to absorb the brunt of Orc counterattacks. Karn led a contingent of World Eaters who exploited any openings created, butchering the greenskins with chain axes and gladius blades. Raldoran's Blood Angels provided tactical flexibility, their jump packs allowing them to bypass obstacles and strike from unexpected angles even in the confined space. Horus himself fought at the heart of this formation, wielding his signature weapon, the Mace Worldbreaker, with devastating effect. Those who witnessed the Warmaster in battle that day spoke of his fluid grace despite his massive frame, how he seemed to anticipate attacks before they came, countering with precisely measured force that wasted no energy yet left only corpses in his wake. More than his physical prowess, however, it was Horus's tactical awareness that proved decisive, as he constantly adjusted the strike team's formation and approach based on the resistance encountered. After hours of intense fighting through the labyrinthine tunnels, the strike team emerged into the cavernous throne chamber of Erlak Erg. The scene that greeted them was both impressive and grotesque, a massive hall filled with thousands of Orc warriors, its walls adorned with the trophies of countless conquests, including the defiled remains of Imperial soldiers and citizens. At the center, seated on a throne built from the fused wreckage of Imperial tanks and warships, was Erlak Erg himself. The warlord stood nearly as tall as a Primarch, his green hide thick with scars from countless battles, his crude but effective armor incorporating technology looted from a dozen human worlds. He wielded a massive power claw that crackled with stolen energy, and a Shuta built to a scale that would require a heavy weapons team of normal humans to operate. Around him stood his Nob Guard, each a formidable warrior in their own right, their bodies enhanced with crude bionics, and their weapons customized for maximum lethality. What followed was not merely a battle, but a clash of legends. Horus signaled the attack, and the strike team exploded into action against seemingly impossible odds. Abaddon and his Terminators engaged the Nob Guard in a brutal melee, while Karn and his World Eaters carved a path through the rank and file Orcs who rushed to their leader's defense. Raldoran's Blood Angels executed a series of jump pack assaults against Orc heavy weapons positions on the chamber's upper galleries, neutralizing the firepower that could have overwhelmed the strike team through sheer volume. This left Horus to confront Erlak Erg directly, a duel between the Imperium's greatest general and the architect of the most significant Xenos empire encountered during the Great Crusade. The combat between them shook the foundations of the throne chamber. Urg's raw strength and surprising speed made him a worthy opponent even for a Primarch, his power claw capable of shearing through ceramite and flesh with equal ease. Several times, the Orc warlord came close to landing a potentially fatal blow, forcing Horus to demonstrate defensive skills rarely needed against lesser opponents. Yet Horus had not risen to his position through strength alone. As the duel progressed, he systematically identified and exploited weaknesses in Urg's fighting style, the slight overextension after certain strikes, the tendency to protect one flank more than the other, the predictable patterns in his combination attacks. Gradually, Horus shifted from defense to a measured offense, each blow precisely calculated to wear down his opponent's stamina and degrade his fighting capability. The end, when it came, was sudden and decisive. Feinting to create an opening, Horus drove Worldbreaker into Urg's chest with such force that it shattered the warlord's crude armor and pulverized the organs beneath. As Urg stumbled backward, Horus pressed the advantage, delivering a series of devastating blows that left the once mighty Orc broken and dying at the foot of his own throne. With a final, almost contemptuous swing, Horus separated the warlord's head from his shoulders, holding it aloft for all in the chamber to see. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The Orcs, witnessing the death of their leader at the hands of this golden giant, fell into disarray. Some fled, others turned on each other, while many simply stood in stunned immobility, their limited intellects unable to process the sudden shift in their fortunes. The strike team exploited this confusion to fight their way back to friendly lines, Horus bearing the head of Urg as a grisly trophy and incontrovertible proof of their victory. The news of the warlord's death spread across Ulanor Prime with remarkable speed, transmitted through the crude but effective psychic field that connected all Orcs. Just as Horus had predicted, the Empire began to fragment almost immediately, with subordinate warbosses declaring themselves the rightful successor to Urg and turning their forces against former allies. What had been a cohesive, if crude, military machine devolved into a collection of warring factions that could be defeated in detail by the Imperial forces. The cleanup operations took several more months, as the legions methodically eliminated the remaining Orc strongholds and purged the conquered worlds of any greenskin presence. The scale of the victory became apparent as Imperial surveyors assessed the extent of the Orc Empire. Over 200 worlds liberated, countless human populations freed from Xenos' enslavement, and a strategic threat to Imperial expansion eliminated. By any measure, the Ulanor Crusade represented one of the most significant achievements of the Great Crusade era. In the aftermath of the Ulanor triumph, Horus found himself in an unprecedented position of authority. The Emperor's decision to bestow upon him the title of Warmaster elevated him above his brother Primarchs, making him second only to the Master of Mankind in the Imperial hierarchy. Yet with this honor came burdens that would gradually erode Horus's once unwavering faith in his father's grand design. The first cracks in Horus's conviction appeared following the Emperor's announcement of his return to Terra. What was presented as a necessary step in the next phase of human evolution, the Emperor focusing on the creation of a human webway project, felt to Horus like abandonment. The Warmaster had grown accustomed to fighting alongside his father, learning directly from the Emperor's example, and receiving immediate guidance when faced with complex decisions. Now, separated by thousands of light years, communication became sporadic and increasingly formal. This sense of abandonment was compounded by the growing administrative responsibilities heaped upon Horus's shoulders. The Warmaster now found himself not only planning military campaigns, but also arbitrating disputes between his brothers, managing the logistics of a galaxy-spanning crusade, and interfacing with the burgeoning Imperial bureaucracy. Reports from hundreds of expeditionary fleets required his attention, while requests for reinforcement or resupply needed careful prioritization. Horus, bred for conquest and leadership, increasingly found himself chained to a command pulpit, drowning in data slates and requisition forms. The Warmaster's frustration with this administrative burden manifested in subtle ways at first. Staff officers noted his growing impatience during strategic briefings, particularly when discussions turned to logistical matters. Remembrancers attached to the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet observed a marked decrease in his participation in cultural events and diplomatic functions. Even his closest advisors in the Mournival detected a new edge to his humor, a bitterness that had not been present before. Particularly galling to Horus was the rise of the Council of Terra, a governing body established by the Emperor to manage the administrative affairs of the growing Imperium. Led by Malcador the Sigillite, this council consisted primarily of mortal men who had never seen a battlefield, yet now wielded authority to allocate resources and set priorities for the Great Crusade. Horus, who had shed blood alongside his Astartes on countless worlds, found it increasingly difficult to justify the council's decisions to his brothers or himself. In a private communication to First Chaplain Erebus of the Word Bearers, later recovered from corrupted data archives on the Vengeful Spirit, Horus expressed his frustration. They sit in marble halls on Terra, these robed bureaucrats, and presume to direct the course of a crusade they have never witnessed. They allocate resources based on theoretical models rather than battlefield realities. When I request additional support for the campaign in the Charout system, they respond with questions about efficiency metrics and resource utilization, as if war can be reduced to a ledger of numbers. This growing resentment toward the imperial bureaucracy created fertile ground for the seeds of discord that Erebus would later plant. The first chaplain of the Word Bearers, having already embraced the ruinous powers following his Primarch Lorger's humiliation at Monarchia, recognized in Horus's frustration an opportunity to advance the cause of chaos. With subtle manipulation, Erebus positioned himself as a sympathetic ear for the Warmaster's complaints, gradually shifting from listener to advisor. Erebus was not alone in this endeavor. Corferon, the adoptive father of Lorger and first captain of the Word Bearers, worked in concert with Erebus to influence not just Horus, but several of the Primarchs who harbored grievances against the Emperor. Their approach was insidious, never directly criticizing the Emperor, but rather raising questions about the direction of the Imperium and the role of the Astartes within it. During joint operations between the Luna Wolves and the Word Bearers, Erebus would engage Horus in philosophical discussions about the nature of the imperial truth. He questioned whether the Emperor's secular rationalism truly served humanity's needs, suggesting that mankind had an inherent spiritual dimension that the imperial truth denied. These conversations, seemingly academic in nature, planted doubts in Horus's mind about the fundamental underpinnings of the Imperium he was fighting to build. The Council of Nicaea represented another critical juncture in Horus's growing disillusionment. The Emperor's decision to restrict the use of psychic powers within the legions struck many as arbitrary and counterproductive. For Horus, who had witnessed the tactical advantages provided by librarians during numerous campaigns, the edict seemed to prioritize abstract principles over battlefield pragmatism. Moreover, the public rebuke of Magnus the Red, a brother whom Horus respected for his intellect and loyalty, suggested that the Emperor's decisions were becoming increasingly disconnected from the realities of the Great Crusade. Horus's private correspondence with Magnus following the council revealed his concerns. "I fear our father no longer values the counsel of those who carry out his will among the stars," he wrote. "He issues proclamations from Terra that ignore the practical challenges we face." The Librarius program has saved countless Astartes lives and accelerated compliance on dozens of worlds. To discard it based on theoretical concerns seems uncharacteristic of the strategic genius I once knew. This reference to the strategic genius I once knew hinted at another troubling aspect of Horus's changing perspective. He had begun to view the Emperor not as the infallible master of mankind, but as a leader who had perhaps lost his way. This shift was subtle but profound, representing the first step toward the betrayal that would later shake the Imperium to its foundations. The tensions between the Primarchs, always present beneath the surface of their brotherhood, intensified under Horus's command. As Warmaster, Horus was responsible for mediating disputes between his brothers, assigning them to campaigns that suited their legion's strengths, and ensuring cooperation when multiple legions operated in the same theater. This role placed him in the difficult position of having to make decisions that inevitably favored some brothers over others. Horus's relationship with Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, exemplified these challenges. The Red Angel's mental instability, exacerbated by the Butcher's nails implanted in his brain on Nuceria, made him both a fearsome warrior and an unpredictable ally. Horus recognized Angron's tactical value in certain types of engagements, but was also aware of the excessive casualties and collateral damage that typically accompanied World Eaters' deployments. This led to a pattern where Horus would assign Angron to campaigns where maximum violence was deemed acceptable, while keeping him away from more delicate compliance actions. This approach, while pragmatic, fueled Angron's resentment. He perceived, not without justification, that his legion was being used as a blunt instrument, called upon when destruction was required, but excluded from more prestigious assignments. In a confrontation aboard the Conqueror following the compliance of a regatta, Angron accused Horus of treating the World Eaters as attack dogs to be unleashed, and then chained when the killing is done. Horus, needing Angron's loyalty, but unwilling to risk civilian massacres, found himself in an impossible position that strained their already tenuous brotherhood. Similar tensions characterized Horus's relationship with Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors. The Lord of Iron had long harbored resentment over his legion's assignment to siege warfare and garrison duty, perceiving it as inglorious compared to the conquests of other legions. As Warmaster, Horus inherited this grievance but found himself perpetuating the same pattern. The Iron Warriors' expertise in siegecraft made them too valuable in that role to reassign. In an attempt to address Perturabo's concerns, Horus granted the Iron Warriors primacy in the Sactrata Deeps campaign, an opportunity for glory against a significant Xenos threat. Yet even this gesture was undermined when Imperial army forces suffered heavy casualties due to what some observers characterized as Perturabo's callous battle plans. Horus was then forced to censure his brother, albeit privately, which only deepened Perturabo's sense of being unappreciated and misunderstood. Mortarion of the Death Guard presented a different challenge. The Primarch of the 14th Legion shared Horus's skepticism toward the Council of Nicaea's restrictions on psychic powers, but from the opposite perspective. Where Horus saw the ban as impractical, Mortarion viewed it as insufficient. The Death Lord's hatred of the warp and all its manifestations stemmed from his experiences on his adoptive homeworld of Barbarus, where he had fought against warp-tainted overlords. He pressed Horus to advocate for even stricter controls, placing the Warmaster in the uncomfortable position of navigating between Magnus's desire for psychic exploration and Mortarion's demand for its complete suppression. These conflicts among the Primarchs required Horus to serve as diplomat as much as commander, a role that consumed his time and energy while generating little tangible progress. The Warmaster increasingly found himself mediating the same disputes repeatedly, with his brothers too set in their perspectives to find common ground. This cycle of intervention without resolution contributed to Horus's growing sense that the Primarchs, despite their transhuman intellects and abilities, were fundamentally incapable of true unity. Erebus and Kor Pharon observed these fraternal tensions with calculating interest, occasionally exacerbating them through carefully placed comments or selective information sharing. They recognized that a divided brotherhood would be more vulnerable to corruption, with each Primarch's individual grievances providing potential leverage for the ruinous powers. The weight of Imperial bureaucracy further strained Horus's patience and resolve. The Warmaster found himself spending increasing amounts of time responding to inquiries from the Council of Terra about resource allocation, compliance rates, and civilian casualties. These administrative demands pulled him away from the battlefield, where his natural talents lay, and forced him into a role that felt both foreign and demeaning. Particularly frustrating was the Council's apparent lack of understanding regarding the realities of the Great Crusade. Malcador's representatives would question the necessity of certain military actions or the expenditure of resources without appreciating the complex threat assessments that had informed Horus's decisions. The Warmaster, who had faced everything from cunning Xenos empires to human civilizations wielding Dark Age technology, found it galling to have his judgment second-guessed by administrators who had never set foot on a battlefield. This bureaucratic oversight extended to the integration of compliant worlds into the Imperium. Horus had developed a nuanced approach to bringing human civilizations into compliance, one that balanced the need for imperial unity with respect for local traditions that did not contradict the imperial truth. Yet increasingly, the Council of Terra imposed standardized governance structures that ignored these cultural considerations, creating resentment among newly compliant populations and sometimes triggering rebellions that required military response. In a gathering of his most trusted captains following the Kelek compliance, Horus expressed his growing frustration. "We win these worlds with blood and diplomacy, carefully balancing force with accommodation to bring humanity together." Then the Administratum arrives with their standardized templates and taxation schedules, undoing months of delicate work in days. They create enemies where we made allies, and then wonder why certain sectors require ongoing military presence. This disconnect between the military and administrative branches of the Imperium created a sense of futility that weighed heavily on Horus. He began to question whether the Great Crusade was truly unifying humanity, or simply imposing a rigid, soulless order that would eventually collapse under its own contradictions. This doubt, once established, provided an opening for more radical alternatives, including those that would be presented to him during his fateful injury on Davin. The imperial truth itself, once a beacon that had guided Horus's actions, increasingly seemed insufficient to address the complexities he encountered. The Emperor's secular rationalism had been designed to free humanity from the superstition and religious dogma that had characterized the Age of Strife. Yet as the Great Crusade pushed into the galactic fringes, Horus and his forces encountered phenomena that defied rational explanation, worlds where reality itself seemed malleable, human populations with unexplainable abilities, artifacts that operated on principles beyond mechanicum understanding. The Warmaster found the Imperial truth's insistence that these phenomena must have scientific explanations increasingly unsatisfying, particularly when such explanations remained elusive. This created a cognitive dissonance that Erebus skillfully exploited, suggesting that perhaps the Emperor had not shared the full truth with his sons. Perhaps there were aspects of reality that the Imperial truth deliberately obscured, either because the Emperor deemed his children unprepared for such knowledge, or because it contradicted the narrative of human self-determination that underpinned the Imperium. These doubts about the Imperial truth intersected with Horus's growing sense of abandonment following the Emperor's return to Terra. The Warmaster could not help but wonder if his father had withdrawn not merely to work on some technological project, as officially claimed, but because he had glimpsed something in the galaxy's future that he chose not to share with his sons. This speculation, encouraged by Erebus's careful insinuations, fed Horus's paranoia and sense of betrayal. The campaign on Davin had initially seemed routine, another world to be brought into compliance by the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet. The planet had already been pacified years earlier by the Word-Bearers Legion, with its indigenous population submitting to Imperial rule and accepting the installation of an Imperial commander, Eugen Temba, to oversee their integration into the Imperium. When reports reached the Vengeful Spirit that Temba had gone rogue, declaring independence from Imperial authority, Horus viewed the situation as a straightforward rebellion requiring swift correction. What the Warmaster could not have known was that Davin represented the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plot by the ruinous powers and their mortal pawns. The Word-Bearer's initial compliance action had been conducted after Lorgar's fall to chaos, allowing the 17th Legion to subtly corrupt the planet's power structures and religious practices. Rather than eradicating the native shamanic traditions as Imperial doctrine demanded, the Word-Bearers had merely driven them underground, where they festered and evolved into more sinister forms of worship. Eugen Temba's apparent rebellion was in fact the final stage of his corruption by the plague god Nurgle. The Imperial commander had been exposed to warp-tainted artifacts deliberately left behind by the Word-Bearers, objects that whispered promises of power and immortality while gradually transforming his body and mind. By the time Horus arrived in the Davin system, Temba had become something no longer fully human, a bloated, pustulant vessel for Nurgle's influence, surrounded by similarly corrupted followers. The focus of this corruption centered on Davin's moon, a swampy, mist-shrouded satellite where Temba had established his headquarters. Augur scans from the Vengeful Spirit revealed unusual energy signatures emanating from the moon's surface, patterns that defied standard Imperial classification. More concerning were the Vox transmissions intercepted from the moon, garbled messages interspersed with sounds that drove several communications officers to self-harm, forcing the Warmaster's staff to implement psychic screening protocols normally reserved for warp travel. Against the advice of his Mournival, Horus decided to lead the assault on Davin's moon personally. His reasoning combined practical military considerations with a deeper, more personal motivation. From a tactical perspective, the Warmaster recognized that a swift decapitation strike against Temba would likely break the rebellion with minimal casualties. Yet there was also pride at work. Horus felt a responsibility to correct a compliance failure that had occurred under his ultimate authority as Warmaster. The landing force comprised elements of the Sons of Horus 1st, 2nd, and 10th Companies, including the Justaran Terminators led by 1st Captain Abaddon. Accompanying them were Mechanicum support units and a detachment from the Legio Mortis Titan Legion, their massive war machines deployed despite the difficult terrain as a show of overwhelming force. Horus expected resistance, but was confident in his legion's ability to overcome whatever forces Temba had assembled. What greeted the Imperial forces on the moon's surface defied all expectations. The landscape itself seemed hostile, with mist that corroded armor and swamp water that boiled at the touch of ceramite. Flora that had been cataloged as harmless during the initial compliance now displayed predatory characteristics, with barbed vines that whipped at passing Astartes and spores that caused hallucinations when inhaled. Most disturbing were Temba's troops, Imperial army soldiers and moon natives transformed by warp influence into shambling abominations that continued fighting even when limbs were severed or internal organs exposed. Captain Garville Loken, commanding elements of the 10th Company during the initial push toward Temba's stronghold, encountered these corrupted troops firsthand. His after-action report, later sealed by Malkador's agents, described soldiers whose flesh sloughed off during combat yet who felt no pain, and whose wounds leaked a viscous fluid that ate through ceramite on contact. Loken's Astartes secured their objectives but suffered unusual casualties, not just from enemy action but from inexplicable equipment failures, weapons jamming or power packs detonating without apparent cause. As the Imperial forces pushed deeper into Temba's territory, they discovered evidence of rituals that defied the Imperial truth's rationalist foundations. Clearings in the swamp contained stone altars stained with bodily fluids, surrounded by arranged corpses in poses that seemed to form patterns visible only from aerial reconnaissance. Mechanicum adepts attempting to analyze these patterns reported equipment malfunctions and inexplicable data corruption. Several adepts who persisted in their analysis developed symptoms similar to those afflicting Temba's followers, necessitating their quarantine and eventual euthanasia. The Warmaster, receiving these reports at his forward command post, recognized that the situation on Davin's moon transcended a simple rebellion. The involvement of forces beyond conventional understanding was becoming increasingly difficult to deny. Yet Horus, shaped by decades of adherence to the Imperial truth, still sought rational explanations, perhaps a previously undocumented Xeno's influence, or Dark Age technology manipulating matter in ways the Imperium had yet to comprehend. The possibility that he faced a genuinely supernatural threat remained, for the moment, beyond his consideration. This changed when the Imperial advance reached Temba's headquarters, a structure that had once been a standard Imperial command bunker, but now resembled a grotesque parody of its original form. The ferrocrete walls had softened, taking on textures reminiscent of flesh, with apertures that opened and closed like breathing orifices. Internal spaces had rearranged themselves, with corridors that led in impossible directions and rooms that seemed larger inside than their external dimensions would allow. The laws of physics themselves seemed negotiable within this corrupted structure. Horus, determined to confront Temba directly, led his Justaran Terminators into the heart of this abomination. The journey through the transformed bunker subjected the Astartes to psychological warfare beyond their training, whispers that seemed to emanate from their own armor, apparitions of fallen battle brothers who beckoned them down side passages, and moments where gravity reversed or time appeared to flow backward. Several Terminators had to be restrained when they began firing at hallucinations or attempting to remove their helmets in environments that would have been instantly fatal to unprotected humans. In the central chamber, Horus finally confronted Eugen Temba. The once human commander had transformed beyond recognition, his bloated form hosting an ecosystem of disease and decay. Pustules the size of human heads erupted and sealed across his surface, while insects that existed in no Imperial biological catalog crawled through his flesh. Most horrifying was his face, still recognizably human despite its distortions, wearing an expression of ecstatic joy that suggested he experienced his corruption as blessing rather than curse. The battle between Horus and this thing that had been Temba defied conventional combat parameters. Temba wielded a blade later identified as an anatheme, a warp-crafted weapon capable of being named against a specific target, making its wounds particularly lethal to that individual. Erebus had secretly provided this weapon to Temba, ensuring it was named specifically for Horus. When the corrupted commander managed to pierce the Warmaster's armor with this blade, the wound it created was unlike any Horus had suffered in centuries of warfare. The anatheme's cut bypassed the Primarch's transhuman healing abilities, creating a wound that not only refused to close, but actively worsened as minutes passed. Black veins spread outward from the injury, carrying a supernatural poison through Horus's system that his enhanced physiology could not counteract. Even as he decapitated Temba with a final blow from Worldbreaker, Horus felt the strength leaving his limbs, his legendary vitality draining away through this seemingly minor wound. The Warmaster's collapse prompted an immediate withdrawal from the moon's surface. Abaddon took command, organizing a fighting retreat while apothecaries attempted to stabilize their Primarch's condition. The journey back to the Vengeful Spirit became a desperate race against the spreading corruption in Horus's body, with the anatheme's poison advancing despite all medical interventions. By the time they reached the flagship, Horus had fallen into a coma that defied all attempts at treatment by the Legion's apothecaries. For 3 days, the Warmaster lay suspended between life and death in the apothecarium of the Vengeful Spirit. The wound in his chest remained open, leaking fluids that corroded surgical tools and burned the skin of unwary Medicae staff. His body temperature fluctuated wildly, at times hot enough to blister the hands of attending apothecaries, at others so cold that frost formed on nearby equipment. Most concerning were the periods when Horus would suddenly speak in languages unknown to the Legion's linguists, his voice modulating between whispers and screams without apparent pattern. The Mournival gathered at their Primarch's bedside, divided on how to proceed. Abaddon advocated for immediate transit to Terra, believing that only the Emperor himself could heal such a wound. Aximan suggested seeking aid from another Primarch, with Magnus, the Red's knowledge of arcane matters making him the logical choice, despite the edicts of Nicaea. Torgadon proposed more conventional approaches, arguing that the Legion's apothecaries simply needed more time to analyze the poison's composition. Loken alone raised the possibility that the wound's supernatural characteristics might require unconventional treatment, though he stopped short of suggesting what form such treatment might take. It was at this moment of crisis that Erebus made his most audacious move. The first chaplain of the Word Bearers, attached to Horus's expedition as a liaison, approached the Mournival with information about a healing cult on Davin itself, the Serpent Lodge. According to Erebus, this lodge represented an ancient tradition that predated Imperial contact, one that had demonstrated remarkable healing abilities during the original compliance action. While technically prohibited under the Imperial Truth, the Lodge had been allowed to continue its practices in secret due to its effectiveness in treating conditions that defied conventional Medicae. The suggestion sparked immediate controversy among the Mournival. Loken and Torgadon expressed skepticism, noting that turning to such a cult would violate the principles of the Imperial truth that Horus himself had championed throughout the Great Crusade. Abaddon initially shared their reservations, but found his resolve weakening as his Primarch's condition deteriorated. Aximand, perhaps most surprisingly, supported Erebus's proposal, arguing that extraordinary circumstances justified extraordinary measures. The debate might have continued indefinitely had Horus's condition not suddenly worsened. The Primarch's body began to undergo rapid metamorphosis, with his skin hardening into carapace in some areas while liquefying in others. His vocal emissions became more disturbing, with multiple voices emerging simultaneously from his throat, some speaking backwards or in impossible harmonic combinations. Several serfs in the Apothecarian committed suicide after exposure to these sounds, leaving notes that referred to the truth behind the skin of the world and similar cryptic phrases. Faced with the imminent loss of their Primarch, the Mournival reluctantly agreed to Erebus's proposal. The Warmaster was transported to the surface of Davin, to a temple complex hidden in the planet's equatorial jungle region. The structure appeared ancient, predating human settlement according to initial assessments, with architecture that incorporated both stone megaliths and what appeared to be ossified organic material of unknown origin. Symbols carved into these surfaces bore disturbing similarities to those observed on Temba's corrupted command bunker, a connection that Erebus dismissed as coincidental when questioned. The interior of the temple housed the Serpent Lodge, a group of robed figures who moved with unsettling grace and spoke with voices that seemed to emanate not from their throats but from the air around them. Their leader, who identified himself only as the Serpent, examined Horus's wound without touching it, his fingers hovering centimeters above the corrupted flesh, while his eyes rolled back to show only whites. His diagnosis, delivered in a voice that seemed to bypass the ears and manifest directly in the listeners' minds, confirmed what many had feared: the wound was beyond conventional healing. The Serpent proposed a ritual that he claimed would allow Horus's own spirit to fight the corruption from within. The Primarch would be placed in a device called the Delphos, a sarcophagus-like structure at the temple's center that appeared to be constructed from the same material as the temple walls. Once sealed inside, Horus would undertake a spiritual journey to confront the source of his affliction, while the lodge members performed ceremonies to strengthen his resolve and guide his path. Loken's objections to this procedure were overruled by Abaddon, who invoked his authority as first captain to approve the treatment. The Juster and Terminators established a perimeter around the temple, preventing any interference with the ritual while simultaneously ensuring that none of the lodge members could leave. Erebus positioned himself as an observer, ostensibly to ensure compliance with those aspects of Imperial protocol that could not be waived, though his true role would only become apparent later. As Horus was sealed within the Delphos, the lodge members began their ceremony. They moved in patterns that seemed random at first, but gradually revealed complex geometries that strained the eyes of observing Astartes. Their chants built upon themselves in layers, creating acoustics that should have been impossible in the temple's open space. Most disturbing was the effect on chronometers and other time-keeping devices. Each showed different readings, with some running backward or cycling through their entire display range in seconds. The ritual within the Serpent Lodge marked the beginning of Horus's transformation from loyal son to arch-traitor. As the Warmaster lay within the Delphos, his consciousness traversed planes of existence beyond mortal comprehension. What appeared to observers as a healing trance was in reality a carefully orchestrated spiritual journey designed by Erebus and the ruinous powers to break Horus's loyalty to the Emperor. Upon emerging from the Delphos, Horus appeared physically healed. The wound that had defied Astartes' medical technology closed without a scar, and his complexion regained its healthy luster. To the relief of the Mournival, their Primarch seemed restored to his former vigor, perhaps even enhanced. He moved with renewed purpose, his eyes bright with an intensity that many interpreted as the fire of determination rekindled. Yet those closest to the Warmaster noticed subtle changes. His skin had taken on an almost waxy quality, with an unnatural pallor that couldn't be attributed solely to his recovery from injury. Under certain lighting conditions, veins beneath his skin appeared darker than normal, sometimes seeming to pulse with shadows rather than blood. Most disturbing were his eyes. While still their original color, they now contained fleeting reflections that didn't correspond to anything in his surroundings. These physical alterations were accompanied by behavioral changes that became increasingly apparent in the weeks following Davin. The Warmaster, once known for his patient consideration of counsel, grew abrupt with advisors who questioned his decisions. His legendary diplomatic touch, which had smoothed relations between fractious Primarchs for decades, gave way to a more direct approach that bordered on intimidation. When contradicted during strategic planning sessions, Horus would sometimes fall silent mid-sentence, his gaze turning inward as though listening to voices only he could hear. First Captain Abaddon, ever loyal to his Primarch, rationalized these changes as necessary adaptations to the growing pressures of the Great Crusade. In his private communications with the Mournival, he argued that the Emperor's absence had forced Horus to adopt a more authoritarian leadership style to maintain momentum across hundreds of campaign fronts. Aximand largely concurred, though his journals revealed growing unease about the Warmaster's increasingly erratic sleep patterns and tendency to conduct strategic reviews in isolation. Torgadon and Loken held deeper reservations. During a private meeting in the Vengeful Spirit's observation deck, recorded by ship systems and later purged from official records, Torgadon expressed concern about Horus's newfound interest in forbidden texts. The Warmaster had requisitioned several volumes from sealed archives, works dating back to Terra's Age of Strife that contained references to entities that dwelled in the Imperium. When Torgadon attempted to discuss these materials, Horus dismissed his concerns with uncharacteristic contempt, suggesting that the Emperor's prohibitions have more to do with control than protection. Loken's worries centered on the Warmaster's changing relationship with the Legion. Where once Horus had regularly walked among his Astartes, learning their names and acknowledging their achievements personally, he now maintained a distance that bordered on aloofness. Battle honors that would previously have been presented by the Primarch himself were now delegated to company captains. Training exercises that traditionally included Horus as an observer or participant proceeded without his presence. When he did address the Legion, his rhetoric shifted from the brotherhood of shared purpose to the necessity of absolute obedience. The most significant behavioral change, however, manifested in Horus's growing psychic abilities. Prior to Davin, the Warmaster had displayed no notable psychic talent beyond the enhanced intuition common to all Primarchs. In the months following his healing, however, he began to exhibit capabilities that alarmed even hardened veterans of the Great Crusade. During compliance negotiations with the Adalian Collective, Horus demonstrated an uncanny ability to know details about the opposing delegation that had not been included in intelligence briefings. When questioned about this knowledge, he attributed it to seeing beyond the veil of pretense, a phrase that several remembrancers noted for its uncharacteristic mysticism. More concerning were reports from his honor guard that objects in the Warmaster's private chambers would occasionally move without being touched, particularly during periods when Horus was deep in contemplation. These emerging psychic abilities coincided with Horus's increasing isolation from Imperial authority. Communications with Terra, already infrequent due to warp disturbances, became almost non-existent. When the Council of Terra dispatched emissaries to discuss campaign priorities, Horus received them with formal correctness, but ignored their directives once they departed. Requests for the 16th Legion to coordinate with other Imperial forces went unanswered or were acknowledged only to be indefinitely delayed. This growing independence allowed Horus to begin the process of identifying and removing loyalist elements from his legion. The purge began subtly, with officers known for their unwavering devotion to the Emperor reassigned to distant expeditionary fleets or seconded to specialist duties that removed them from the Legion's command structure. Training accidents increased among squads that had expressed reservations about the Warmaster's new direction, while Astartes who embraced Horus's more aggressive stance received accelerated promotion. The case of Captain Eacton Cruz illustrated the precarious position of those who maintained their loyalty to the Emperor. Once a respected officer whose service dated back to the Legion's founding on Terra, Cruz found himself systematically marginalized after questioning the Legion's increasingly brutal compliance actions. His company was depleted through reassignments, his tactical input during planning sessions dismissed as outdated, and his access to the Warmaster restricted by newly appointed equerries who cited Horus's demanding schedule. Simultaneously, Horus began cultivating deeper relationships with Primarchs whose grievances against the Emperor made them susceptible to corruption. Mortarion, bitter about the Emperor's handling of Typhon's psychic abilities. Angron, never reconciled to being torn from his fellow gladiators on New Syria. Perdurabo, resentful of the inglorious siege warfare assignments given to his Iron Warriors. Each received personal communications from the Warmaster that validated their complaints while suggesting that the Great Crusade had drifted from its original purpose. These communications, carefully crafted to appear as fraternal concern rather than sedition, contained subtle distortions of the Emperor's directives and intentions. When discussing the Council of Terra with Perdurabo, Horus characterized its formation as the Emperor's preference for bureaucrats over warriors. In correspondence with Angron, he described the Edict of Nicaea as the first step in dismantling the autonomy of the legions. Each message was tailored to aggravate existing wounds, while positioning Horus as the sympathetic brother who truly understood their value. The corruption spreading through Horus manifested physically in ways that required increasingly elaborate concealment. During a diplomatic function with Imperial army commanders, several officers reported a momentary distortion in the Warmaster's features, a rippling effect that briefly revealed something inhuman beneath his familiar countenance. This incident was quickly attributed to fatigue and poor lighting, with those who persisted in their accounts reassigned to frontier deployments where their unreliable observations would not undermine morale. More difficult to conceal were the changes to Horus's quarters aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Serfs assigned to clean these chambers reported unusual phenomena. Surfaces that felt warm to the touch despite environmental controls, mirrors that showed distorted reflections when the Warmaster was not present, and most disturbing, a persistent organic odor that no amount of sanitation could eliminate. After several serfs disappeared following these reports, the Warmaster's chambers were declared off-limits to all but a select few whose loyalty had been thoroughly tested. Horus's communion with the ruinous powers deepened through rituals conducted in these private spaces. While maintaining an outward adherence to the imperial truth in public, the Warmaster engaged in increasingly elaborate ceremonies behind closed doors. Guided by texts provided by Erebus, he learned to enter trance states that allowed direct communication with entities in the warp. These communions left physical evidence, small burns on the deck plating arranged in geometric patterns, residues of unknown composition that ate through metallic surfaces, and on one documented occasion, the discovery of a servitor whose augmetics had been reconfigured into configurations that defied technological logic. Despite these manifestations, Horus maintained his charismatic leadership through a combination of genuine strategic brilliance and supernatural manipulation. In War Council meetings, he continued to display the tactical genius that had made him Warmaster, developing battle plans that achieved compliance with unprecedented efficiency. What observers could not perceive was the psychic undercurrent that accompanied these presentations, a subtle influence that made his arguments seem more compelling and alternatives less viable than objective analysis would suggest. This influence extended beyond the planning stages to battlefield performance. Astartes fighting in the Warmaster's presence reported experiences of heightened awareness and physical capability, as though their transhuman bodies were being pushed beyond even their enhanced limits. Post-battle medical examinations revealed unusual neurochemical profiles in these warriors, with elevated levels of compounds associated with aggression and diminished activity in brain regions linked to empathy and restraint. These changes persisted after combat, gradually altering the psychological makeup of the Legion. The first overt sign of Horus's betrayal came with the purge of loyalist elements during the Istvan III campaign. What began as a standard compliance action against a rebellious system transformed into a calculated atrocity when Horus deployed suspected loyalists to the planet's surface before virus bombing the entire world. The scale of this betrayal shocked even those who had noticed the Warmaster's changing nature. In a single action, Horus not only eliminated those within his legion who might oppose his plans, but also demonstrated his willingness to employ methods that violated every principle of the Great Crusade. The virus bombing of Istvan III revealed the extent of Horus's corruption in its methodical cruelty. The deployment orders for the surface action specifically included officers and squads who had expressed continued devotion to the Emperor or questioned recent Legion directives. Garvil Loken, Tarek Torgeddon, and other members of the Mournival who had maintained their loyalty found themselves assigned to the initial assault, ostensibly as a mark of honor, but in reality a death sentence. When the virus bombs fell, transforming the atmosphere into a lethal agent that liquefied organic matter on contact, Horus watched the planetary displays with an expression that witnesses described as serene satisfaction. Yet even this betrayal was calculated to maintain a veneer of legitimacy. In communications with the wider Imperium, Horus characterized the virus bombing as a necessary response to a dangerous contagion discovered on Istvan III, a pathogen so virulent that extreme measures were required to prevent its spread. The deployment of Astartes to the surface was explained as a tragic miscommunication during a rapidly evolving crisis. These explanations, delivered with the Warmaster's characteristic gravity and apparent regret, bought crucial time for his broader plans to develop. The survival of some loyalists on Istvan III, protected by warning from Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children, complicated Horus's narrative but did not derail it. When these survivors established defensive positions and continued to resist despite overwhelming odds, the Warmaster adjusted his strategy. He deployed additional forces to the surface with orders to eliminate all remaining loyalists, presenting this action to the wider crusade as a rescue mission to extract survivors from a contaminated environment. Throughout this period, Horus maintained his outward appearance as the Emperor's devoted son while secretly preparing for open rebellion. In communications with Terra, he continued to report campaign successes and compliance statistics, occasionally expressing concern about warp disturbances that prevented more regular contact. To brother Primarchs not yet brought into his confidence, he sent messages emphasizing the challenges facing the Great Crusade and the need for unity among the legions, messages that contained no overt treachery but laid groundwork for future appeals. This dual existence required increasingly elaborate measures as Horus's physical corruption advanced. Remembrancers attached to the 16th Legion found their access to the Warmaster restricted to carefully staged appearances where lighting and duration were precisely controlled. Official portraits from this period show subtle alterations to Horus's image, shadows deepened to conceal discoloration, angles chosen to minimize apparent changes to his physiognomy, and in some cases, digital manipulation to restore features that had begun to alter beyond acceptable parameters. Human dignitaries who met with the Warmaster reported disquieting experiences that they struggled to articulate afterward. Many described a sense of pressure behind their eyes during audiences, followed by periods of missing time in their recollection. Others noted that while they could remember the content of discussions with Horus, they could not recall his exact words or the specific expressions that accompanied them. These accounts, collected by agents of Malkador the Sigillite, provided some of the first indications to Terra that something was fundamentally wrong with the Warmaster. By the time the Loyalist forces arrived at Istvan V, responding to Horus's false reports of rebellion, the Warmaster's corruption had progressed to a point where it could no longer be fully concealed. His armor, modified by dark Mechanicum adepts who had pledged themselves to his cause, incorporated technologies that violated Imperial sanctions. Its surfaces bore subtle iconography that, while appearing decorative to casual observation, formed patterns that caused discomfort when viewed for extended periods. Most significantly, the armor included systems designed to channel and amplify psychic energies, allowing Horus to manifest his growing warp-granted powers even on the battlefield. The drop site massacre on Istvan V represents perhaps the most meticulously planned betrayal in Imperial history. Horus's strategy was not merely a military ambush, but a psychological operation designed to break the loyalist forces both physically and spiritually. The plan leveraged the trust between brother legions, a trust Horus had spent decades cultivating, to create a trap that would eliminate 3 loyal legions in a single stroke. Preparations began months before the actual battle. Horus had carefully assessed which Primarchs and their legions would remain loyal to the Emperor and which might be swayed to his cause. The Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders were identified as unshakably loyal, making them primary targets for elimination. Meanwhile, the Alpha Legion, Iron Warriors, Night Lords, and Word Bearers presented opportunities for recruitment, each harboring grievances that Horus could exploit. The Warmaster's manipulation of these potential allies demonstrated his profound understanding of his brother's psychology. With Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, Horus emphasized the Emperor's perceived ingratitude, pointing to the thankless siege warfare and garrison duties the 4th Legion had been assigned throughout the Great Crusade. "Your warriors break worlds, while Guilliman's sons receive the laurels," Horus reportedly told Perturabo during a private meeting aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The Lord of Iron, who had long harbored resentment over his legion's utilitarian deployments, found in Horus someone who finally recognized his true worth. For Conrad Kurz, Primarch of the Night Lords, Horus offered understanding rather than the condemnation he had faced from other brothers. The Warmaster acknowledged Kurz's precognitive visions of a dark future, visions that had been dismissed as madness by the Emperor. By validating these experiences, Horus positioned himself as an ally who accepted Kurz's methods as necessary, given what the Night Haunter had foreseen. Alfarius of the Alpha Legion presented a more complex challenge. The youngest Primarch had always operated with a level of independence that bordered on insubordination, his legion's methods often at odds with standard Imperial protocols. Rather than attempting to control Alfarius directly, Horus appealed to his intellectual vanity, sharing secret knowledge about the Emperor's supposed true plans, plans that would ultimately see the legions disbanded once their usefulness ended. This information, carefully crafted to align with Alfarius's existing suspicions, pushed the Alpha Legion toward Horus's camp, while allowing its Primarch to believe he was making an autonomous decision. The Word Bearers required no such manipulation, having already fallen to chaos under Lorgar's leadership years before. Instead, they served as Horus's advisors in corruption, with Erebus and Corferon providing guidance on the rituals and sacrifices that would curry favor with the ruinous powers. With these legions secured, Horus crafted the trap that would become known as the Drop Site Massacre. The plan's elegance lay in its exploitation of standard Imperial military doctrine. When reports of Horus's betrayal at Istvan III reached Terra, the Emperor would naturally dispatch loyal legions to confront the rebellion. Horus predicted that this response force would include those Primarchs most devoted to the Emperor, likely Ferrus Manus, Vulcan, and Corax, whose loyalty was beyond question. The Warmaster's strategy called for a 3-phase engagement. First, his openly declared traitor forces, the Sons of Horus, Death Guard, Emperor's Children, and World Eaters, would establish defensive positions on Istvan V, presenting a target too tempting for the Loyalists to ignore. Second, when the loyal legions deployed to the planet's surface, the traitors would conduct a fighting withdrawal, drawing the Loyalists deeper into the landing zone. Finally, the supposedly loyal reserve force, the Alpha Legion, Iron Warriors, Night Lords, and Word Bearers, would reveal their true allegiance at the critical moment, catching the Loyalists in a devastating crossfire. Critical to this plan was the manipulation of Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands. Horus understood that Ferrus's rigid sense of honor and his close brotherhood with Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children created both a vulnerability and an opportunity. By ensuring that Fulgrim would be present on the battlefield, Horus guaranteed that Ferrus would lead from the front, driven by a desire to personally confront his fallen brother. This predictable behavior would place the Iron Hands command structure in the most vulnerable position when the trap was sprung. The psychological aspects of the plan extended beyond the battlefield. Horus arranged for astropathic communications, suggesting that the 4 loyal legions in the second wave were responding to the Emperor's call with maximum speed and commitment. These messages, intercepted by the genuinely loyal legions, created expectations of reinforcement that would make the eventual betrayal all the more devastating. The Warmaster even staged mock conflicts between his forces and those of Perturabo and Kurz in frontier systems, fabricating evidence of continued loyalty to the throne that would reach Terra through merchant vessels and administrative channels. As the Loyalist fleet approached the Istvan system, everything was in place. The traitor forces had established defensive positions across a vast plain that came to be known as the Urgal Depression. Artillery emplacements, bunker networks, and overlapping fields of fire created a formidable defensive line that would nevertheless appear potentially vulnerable to a determined assault. Orbital defenses were similarly arranged to present a challenge that would require the Loyalists to commit fully to the attack without appearing so overwhelming as to force a strategic withdrawal. Ferrus Manus, commanding the Loyalist forces from his flagship Fist of Iron, fell into Horus's trap exactly as predicted. Scans of the planet's surface revealed the traitor deployments, including the apparent command center, where Fulgrim's presence was deliberately made detectable. The Iron Hand's Primarch, his judgment clouded by anger at his brother's betrayal, ordered an immediate full-scale assault rather than the more cautious approach advocated by Corax of the Raven Guard. The initial landings proceeded according to standard Legion doctrine. Drop pods and assault craft descended through the atmosphere in precisely plotted patterns designed to overwhelm specific sectors of the traitor defenses. The Iron Hands formed the center of the Loyalist advance, with the Salamanders on their right flank and the Raven Guard on their left. This textbook deployment played directly into Horus's hands, creating a predictable front that his forces could engage while withdrawing in a controlled manner. As the ground battle intensified, the traitor forces executed their fighting withdrawal with disciplined precision. The Death Guard absorbed the Salamanders' advance, their resilience allowing them to endure punishing assaults while gradually ceding ground. The Emperor's children engaged the Iron Hands in a series of feints and counterattacks that drew Ferrus Manus's forces deeper into the trap, with Fulgrim visible at the front, personally challenging his former brother. On the left flank, the World Eater's berserker assaults against the Raven Guard appeared desperate and uncoordinated, but actually served to prevent Corax from providing support to the center. Throughout this phase, Horus observed from his command center aboard the Vengeful Spirit, making minor adjustments to the battle plan as conditions evolved. When Vulcan's Salamanders began to push too effectively against Mortarian's Death Guard, threatening to break through ahead of schedule, Horus redirected elements of the Sons of Horus to reinforce that sector. When Corax's tactical acumen allowed the Raven Guard to begin outflanking Angron's World Eaters, the Warmaster authorized the deployment of Titan support that forced the Loyalists back into the planned engagement zone. The most critical moment came when the Loyalist forces, having pushed the traitors back to their secondary defensive positions, believed victory was within reach. Ferrus Manus, his tactical judgment compromised by the prospect of confronting Fulgrim, committed his reserves to a final push that he believed would break the traitor lines. Vulcan, honoring his commitment to the battle plan, supported this thrust with his fire drakes, while Corax reluctantly shifted forces from his left flank to exploit the anticipated breakthrough. It was at precisely this moment, with the Loyalists fully committed and their formation extended, that Horus gave the signal for the second phase of his plan. The four supposedly loyal legions, positioned to the rear of the Urgal Depression in what should have been a supporting role, revealed their true allegiance. The Night Lords struck first, their terror tactics ideally suited to the shock value Horus sought. The Iron Warriors' artillery, prepositioned under the guise of providing supporting fire for the Loyalist advance, turned instead on the exposed rear of the Iron Hands formation. The Word Bearers and Alpha Legion moved to cut off the Loyalists' retreat, their coordinated assault closing the trap with mechanical precision. The effect was devastating beyond even Horus's expectations. The Loyalist forces, already engaged in heavy fighting to their front, suddenly found themselves under attack from positions they had considered secure. Communications channels filled with confused reports and desperate calls for clarification, as Astartes, who had fought side by side for decades now, turned their weapons on each other. The psychological impact of this betrayal, particularly on the younger legionaries who had never known discord between the legions, created moments of paralysis that proved fatal in the intense close quarters fighting that followed. Horus Manus, realizing too late the magnitude of the trap, attempted to reorganize his forces for a fighting withdrawal. His orders, delivered with typical Iron Hand directness, called for the formation of defensive circles that could support each other while falling back to the landing zones. Had these commands been fully implemented, the Loyalists might have extracted a significant portion of their forces. However, the Iron Hand's Primarch himself compromised this plan by pursuing his personal vendetta against Fulgrim, leading his Morlock's bodyguard in a direct assault on the Emperor's Children's position. The duel between Horus Manus and Fulgrim represented the emotional centerpiece of Horus's strategy. By ensuring that these once closest brothers would confront each other directly, the Warmaster created a spectacle that distracted the Iron Hand's command structure at the most critical moment. The sight of their Primarch engaged in single combat drew the attention of key officers who should have been coordinating the withdrawal, while the eventual outcome, Horus Manus' death at Fulgrim's hands, shattered the Iron Hand's morale beyond recovery. Vulcan and Corax, separated from each other and lacking the overall strategic picture, made different decisions that ultimately proved equally disastrous. Vulcan, true to his protective nature, attempted to hold ground with his salamanders to cover the retreat of wounded Loyalists. This noble but tactically unsound choice resulted in his legion being surrounded and systematically annihilated by Death Guard and Word-Bearer's forces attacking from multiple directions. The Salamander's resilience allowed many individuals to survive this onslaught, but as an organized fighting force, they ceased to exist on the fields of Istvan V. Corax, recognizing the impossibility of victory, ordered an immediate disengagement that prioritized preserving as many Raven Guard as possible. His legion's specialization in stealth and rapid movement served them well in the initial stages of this withdrawal, allowing significant numbers to break contact with the traitor forces. However, the Alpha Legion had anticipated this response, positioning infiltrators along likely escape routes and deploying jamming technology that disrupted the Raven Guard's coordination. What began as an organized retreat devolved into scattered bands of survivors fighting their way toward extraction points that often proved to be killing grounds prepared by Alfarius's forces. The space battle above Istvan V mirrored the ground action in its one-sided brutality. Loyalist vessels, having moved into close orbit to support their ground forces, found themselves caught between the planet's defense grid and the suddenly hostile ships of the Iron Warriors and Alpha Legion. Perturabo, applying the same methodical approach to void warfare that characterized his siegecraft, had positioned his fleet's elements precisely where they could deliver maximum damage when they revealed their treachery. Night Lord's strike cruisers, operating with uncharacteristic discipline under Kerr's direct command, targeted Loyalist communication arrays and command bridges in the opening moments, creating confusion that prevented an effective response. The aftermath of the Dropsite massacre transformed Horus's rebellion from a troubling but potentially containable insurrection into an existential threat to the Imperium. With 3 loyal legions effectively removed from the equation, the balance of transhuman power shifted decisively in the Warmaster's favor. The Iron Hands, decapitated by the loss of their Primarch, fragmented into chapter-sized formations driven by vengeance rather than strategic purpose. The Salamanders, reduced to perhaps 1,000 battle-worthy Marines, required years to rebuild their fighting strength. The Raven Guard, while preserving more of their number thanks to Corax's decision to withdraw, nevertheless suffered casualties that would have broken a lesser force. Beyond the military impact, the psychological effect of the Dropsite massacre reverberated throughout the Imperium. The demonstration that Astartes could turn against Astartes, that the bonds of brotherhood forged during the Great Crusade could be so completely severed, created a crisis of confidence within the Imperial military structure. Commanders who had unquestioningly accepted Space Marine detachments now viewed these transhuman warriors with suspicion, wondering if they too might suddenly reveal hidden loyalties. This breakdown in trust complicated Imperial defensive efforts as the heresy expanded, with valuable time lost to verification protocols and redundant command structures designed to guard against further betrayals. For Horus, the drop site massacre represented not just a military victory, but confirmation of his favored status with the ruinous powers. The perfect execution of his plan, the elimination of 3 loyal legions as effective fighting forces, and the death of a Primarch by another Primarch's hand, constituted a sacrifice of unprecedented magnitude to the Dark Gods. In the aftermath, the Warmaster's connection to the warp deepened further, granting him insights and abilities that further accelerated his corruption while enhancing his strategic capabilities. In the aftermath of the drop site massacre, Horus stood at the apex of his power. The Warmaster's corruption was now complete, his bargain with the ruinous powers sealed in the blood of his loyal brothers. With 3 loyalist legions effectively neutralized and 4 more revealed as traitors, the balance of power had shifted dramatically in his favor. What followed was not merely a military campaign, but a meticulous restructuring of forces and strategies that would define the greatest civil war in human history. Horus's first act following Istvan V was to formally reorganize the traitor legions under his direct command. The Sons of Horus, already renamed from Luna Wolves to reflect their Primarch's ascendancy, took pride of place as the vanguard of the rebellion. This renaming was more than symbolic. It represented a fundamental shift in the Legion's identity. Where the Luna Wolves had fought for the Emperor's vision of unity, the Sons of Horus now fought for their Primarch's ambition. Their heraldry changed accordingly, the white and black of the Luna Wolves giving way to a sea-green color that mirrored the pallid complexion Horus had developed since his corruption on Davin. This transformation extended beyond aesthetics to doctrine and organization. Under Horus's direction, First Captain Abaddon restructured the Legion's companies to emphasize overwhelming force and psychological warfare. The Juster Terminators, once deployed primarily for decapitation strikes against enemy leadership, now formed the core of terror units designed to break enemy morale through displays of excessive brutality. Training protocols shifted from the balanced approach that had characterized the Luna Wolves to emphasize close-quarters combat and execution-style kills that would sow maximum fear. The other traitor legions underwent similar transformations, each embracing aspects of their nature that the Emperor had sought to temper. The World Eaters, under Angron's increasingly erratic leadership, abandoned all pretense of discipline, embracing the Butcher's nails implants that turned them into berserkers. The Death Guard, influenced by Mortarian's growing fascination with endurance and resilience, began experimenting with toxins and biological agents that pushed the boundaries of even their transhuman physiology. The Emperor's children, following Fulgrim's complete surrender to Slaanesh, descended into a pursuit of sensory extremes that corrupted their once perfect discipline. Horus managed these transformations with calculated precision, allowing each legion enough autonomy to explore their new identities while ensuring they remained focused on the ultimate goal, the overthrow of the Emperor. When excesses threatened operational capability, as with the Emperor's children's increasingly elaborate combat rituals, the Warmaster would intervene personally, reminding his brothers that indulgence must never compromise effectiveness. This balance between corruption and functionality extended to Horus's diplomatic efforts beyond the Astartes legions. Recognizing that transhuman warriors alone could not conquer the Imperium, the Warmaster sought allies among the myriad forces that comprised the Emperor's domain. His most significant success came with the Mechanicum of Mars, where long-simmering tensions between traditionalists and progressives provided fertile ground for subversion. Horus's approach to the Mechanicum demonstrated his diplomatic acumen. Rather than attempting to corrupt the entire organization at once, he focused on key individuals whose influence could cascade through the hierarchy. Kelber Hal, the Fabricator General of Mars, had long chafed under the Emperor's restrictions on technological exploration. The Warmaster's emissaries approached him with offers of freedom from the Treaty of Mars, the opportunity to pursue knowledge without Imperial oversight or prohibitions against artificial intelligence and certain weapons technologies. These overtures were accompanied by tangible proof of Horus's sincerity. Through agents within the Sons of Horus, the Warmaster provided the Mechanicum with Xenos artifacts recovered during the Great Crusade but withheld from Mars by Imperial decree. These objects containing technologies beyond Imperial understanding served as irresistible bait for tech priests whose entire existence centered on the acquisition of knowledge. When combined with carefully edited evidence suggesting the Emperor planned to further restrict Mechanicum autonomy after the Great Crusade's completion, these gifts triggered the schism that would create the Dark Mechanicum. The civil war that erupted on Mars, later termed the Schism of Mars, provided Horus with not just allies, but access to the vast manufacturing capabilities of the Red Planet. Forge complexes that had produced the Imperium's most advanced weaponry now turned their output towards supplying the traitor legions. Titans, previously loyal to the Emperor, were corrupted by tech priests who replaced their machine spirits with warp entities, creating god machines of unprecedented power and malevolence. Horus's diplomatic efforts extended beyond human allies to include Xenos species that had previously faced extinction at the hands of the Great Crusade. The Warmaster's agents established contact with remnants of the Lair, a serpentine species whose empire had been destroyed by the Emperor's children early in the Crusade. The few survivors, harboring understandable hatred for the Imperium, provided the traitors with psychoactive compounds that enhanced combat performance while opening the mind to warp influence. More controversial within the traitor legions was Horus's accommodation with certain Eldar factions. While most of this ancient species opposed chaos in all its forms, some outcast groups saw in the heresy an opportunity to strike against the Imperium that had encroached upon their diminished realms. Horus leveraged their precognitive abilities to anticipate Imperial movements, while offering them sanctuary in regions that would fall under his control after victory. This arrangement remained secret from most of his followers, as even corrupted Astartes maintained their ingrained hatred of the Xenos. With his alliances secured, Horus turned to grand strategy. The Warmaster's plan for conquering the Imperium reflected both his military genius and his newfound warp-granted insights. Rather than attempting to secure the entirety of Imperial space, an impossibility given the Imperium's vast expanse, he identified key systems and transit routes that would allow him to isolate Terra while preventing the consolidation of loyalist forces. The Warmaster divided the galaxy into operational theaters, assigning specific traitor legions to each based on their capabilities and the nature of the expected resistance. Perdurabo's Iron Warriors, masters of siegecraft, were tasked with reducing key fortress worlds that could otherwise have served as rallying points for loyalist forces. The Alpha Legion, with their infiltration expertise, spread throughout systems where loyalty was uncertain, undermining Imperial authority through sabotage and false flag operations. The Night Lords terrorized civilian populations on worlds near crucial warp routes, creating refugee crises that clogged shipping lanes and complicated Imperial logistics. Horus himself, with the Sons of Horus and elements of the World Eaters, focused on decapitation strikes against concentrations of loyalist military power. The Warmaster's keen strategic mind, enhanced by warp-granted foresight, allowed him to identify vulnerabilities in Imperial deployments that would have escaped conventional analysis. When the 27th Expeditionary Fleet attempted to establish a blocking position in the Tyros cluster, Horus anticipated their arrival, positioning his forces to attack while the Loyalists were still translating from the warp. The resulting battle saw 3 battleships and their escorts destroyed before they could achieve combat readiness. The most ambitious element of Horus's strategy involved the deliberate manipulation of warp currents to isolate Terra from potential reinforcements. Working with sorcerers from the Thousand Suns and Word-Bearers, the Warmaster orchestrated massive rituals on worlds along key warp routes. These ceremonies, involving the sacrifice of millions of civilians, created warp storms of unprecedented scale and intensity. Navigators attempting to plot courses through these regions reported impossible conditions, currents that changed direction without warning, predatory entities that hunted ships through the immaterium, and temporal distortions that could trap vessels for subjective centuries. This warp strategy proved particularly effective against Roboute Guilliman's Ultramarines, the largest legion and potentially the greatest threat to Horus's plans. The 500 worlds of Ultramar found themselves cut off from Terra by storms that defied navigation, forcing Guilliman to focus on defending his realm rather than reinforcing the throne world. Similar isolation affected the Dark Angels and Space Wolves, preventing these powerful loyalist forces from coordinating their efforts against the traitor advance. With the wider Imperium fractured by warp storms and targeted strikes, Horus turned his attention to the ultimate prize, Terra itself. The approach to the throne world would require breaking through the formidable defenses of the solar system, where Rogel Dorn's Imperial fists had spent years creating layered fortifications of unprecedented strength. Rather than attempting a frontal assault against these positions, Horus developed a more circuitous approach that would draw defenders away from Terra while securing resources needed for the final push. The Siege of Malech exemplified this approach. This night world, home to several powerful households with their formidable war machines, occupied a strategic position along the traitor's path to Terra. More importantly, Malech contained a hidden warp portal that the Emperor himself had used millennia earlier to commune with the Chaos Gods. Horus, armed with knowledge provided by the ruinous powers, sought to use this portal to further enhance his already considerable abilities. The campaign for Malech demonstrated Horus's evolving battlefield role. No longer merely a superlative warrior and commander, the Warmaster had become a conduit for warp energies that could alter the fabric of reality. During the assault on House Divine's fortress, loyalist defenders reported reality distorting in Horus's vicinity, weapons malfunctioning, energy fields collapsing, and in some cases, Knight's pilots experiencing visions that paralyzed them with terror. These effects, products of the Warmaster's growing psychic might, proved as decisive as the traitor force's conventional military superiority. When Horus finally accessed the warp portal hidden beneath Malech's surface, the resulting influx of power transformed him further. Witnesses described the Warmaster emerging from the chamber surrounded by an aura of darkness that swallowed light, his eyes containing galaxies of malevolence. His physical form, already altered by corruption, now barely contained the energies coursing through it, with his armor incorporating increasingly elaborate mechanisms to channel and control these forces. This ascension came with enhanced strategic insight that bordered on precognition. In the campaigns following Malech, Horus displayed an uncanny ability to anticipate Imperial responses, positioning his forces to counter moves that loyalist commanders had not yet implemented. When the White Scars attempted a surprise attack against his supply lines in the Kondak system, they found the Sons of Horus already deployed in a perfect counter formation, as though the Warmaster had read Khan's plans directly from his mind. As the traitor forces pushed deeper into the Imperium, Horus faced the challenge of maintaining cohesion among his increasingly diverse coalition. The Primarchs, each pursuing their own agenda alongside the broader rebellion, required careful management to prevent their individual ambitions from compromising the war effort. Angron's bloodlust, Fulgrim's hedonism, Mortarian's bitterness, and Perdurabo's need for validation all demanded different handling approaches. Horus managed these competing personalities through a combination of charisma, strategic assignment, and when necessary, displays of power that reminded his brothers of his favored status with the ruinous powers. When Fulgrim's excesses threatened to compromise a crucial compliance action in the Perdus system, Horus summoned the Primarch to his flagship. What transpired in that meeting remains unrecorded, but Fulgrim emerged visibly shaken, his legion's activities afterward notably more focused on military objectives rather than pursuit of sensation. The Warmaster applied similar management techniques to the mortal elements of his coalition. The Dark Mechanicum, Imperial army units that had joined the rebellion, and civilian administrators who controlled vital production facilities all received personalized attention that made them feel valued while ensuring their contributions aligned with the broader strategy. Horus would appear unexpectedly at manufacturing centers to commend workers, dispatch Sons of Horus veterans to bolster wavering army units, and grant technological freedom to Dark Mechanicum adepts who achieved production targets. This administrative acumen, combined with military genius and warp-granted power, made Horus the most dangerous adversary the Imperium had ever faced. As his forces pushed inexorably toward Terra, even loyalists who abhorred his betrayal could not help but acknowledge the Warmaster's effectiveness. A transmission attributed to Rogel Dorn, intercepted by Alpha Legion operatives during the fortification of Terra, perhaps best summarized the threat. "We face not merely my brother's martial prowess, which alone would be formidable, but his unmatched ability to turn strength against itself, to find the breaking point in any defense, and to inspire others to follow him into damnation. It is this combination that makes him the Emperor's most terrible creation." The transformation of Horus from loyal son to arch-traitor reached its zenith in the aftermath of Malech. The energies he had absorbed through the ancient portal fundamentally altered his being, elevating him beyond the limitations of his transhuman physiology. What emerged from that forbidden chamber was no longer merely a Primarch, but a vessel of chaos undivided, a conduit through which the ruinous powers could manifest their will in the material realm. The physical changes in Horus became impossible to conceal. His skin took on a pallid, waxy texture that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. The veins beneath pulsed with energies that defied spectroscopic analysis, sometimes appearing as liquid shadow rather than blood. His eyes, once clear and piercing, now contained swirling vortices that observers found impossible to look into for more than moments without experiencing vertigo and nausea. Most disturbing was his voice, still recognizable as the charismatic tone that had inspired billions, but now layered with subsonic frequencies that bypassed the ear to resonate directly in the listener's mind. These changes necessitated modifications to the Warmaster's armor. Dark Mechanicum adepts, under the direction of the tech priest Regulus, incorporated arcane technologies into the warplate that contained and channeled Horus's burgeoning powers. Venting systems released excess warp energy in controlled bursts, creating a nimbus of darkness around the Warmaster during periods of heightened emotion. Crystalline focusing arrays embedded in the gauntlets allowed him to direct concentrated blasts of warp energy capable of vaporizing even ceramite armor. Most significant was the integration of the Talon of Horus, a lightning claw of unprecedented size and lethality that served as both weapon and psychic amplifier. The armor's appearance reflected its wearer's transformation. The clean lines and functional aesthetic of traditional Astartes plate gave way to a more organic design, with surfaces that seemed to ripple subtly when not directly observed. Decorative elements incorporated symbols that strained the eye and mind, creating discomfort in viewers that transcended mere psychological aversion. The Warmaster's personal iconography evolved accordingly, the Eye of Horus taking on dimensions and angles that should have been geometrically impossible. With his ascension complete, Horus established what came to be known as Lupercal's court, a dark reflection of the Imperial hierarchy centered around his person. The structure of this court formalized the relationships between the traitor Primarchs and established precedents among their legions. While ostensibly a practical arrangement for coordinating the war effort, the court also served to manage the increasingly volatile personalities of the corrupted Primarchs and channel their energies toward the ultimate goal of overthrowing the Emperor. At the apex of this hierarchy stood Horus himself, bearing the self-appointed title Warmaster Ascendant. Beneath him, the Primarchs were arranged in tiers that reflected both their military contributions and their favor with the ruinous powers. Lorgar Aurelian of the Word Bearers occupied a position of special privilege as the High Priest of the Rebellion, his deep understanding of chaos rituals making him invaluable for maintaining the warp storms that isolated Terra. Angron of the World Eaters and Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, both elevated to Demon Prince status, commanded fearsome respect for their martial prowess and direct connection to their patron gods. Mortarion, Perdurabo, and Conrad Kurz formed a second tier, Primarchs who had embraced corruption but not yet surrendered their humanity entirely. Each commanded substantial military forces that were essential to the campaign, yet their reluctance to fully submit to demonic possession limited their standing in Horus's court. Alfarius of the Alpha Legion occupied an ambiguous position, his methods and motivations remaining obscure even to his brothers. Magnus the Red, newest addition to the traitor forces, maintained a position apart from the main hierarchy, his legion's psychic capabilities making them both valuable and distrusted. This formalization of relationships extended beyond the Primarchs to their legion commanders and specialist formations. First Captain Ezekiel Abaddon of the Sons of Horus enjoyed precedence over all non-Primarch military leaders, his position as Horus's heir apparent, acknowledged even by Primarchs who chafed at taking direction from an Astartes. Typhon of the Death Guard, Eidolon of the Emperor's Children, and Karn of the World Eaters formed a second tier of transhuman leadership, each commanding substantial forces and enjoying direct access to the Warmaster when their Primarchs were occupied elsewhere. The court was not merely administrative but ceremonial, with rituals that reinforced the hierarchical structure while channeling warp energies to enhance the traitor's capabilities. The Warmaster would hold audience in the Stratagem of the Vengeful Spirit, seated upon a throne fashioned from materials that defied conventional analysis. Supplicants approached along a pathway inscribed with symbols that subtly altered their perception, ensuring they arrived before Horus in a state of heightened suggestibility. The atmosphere within these gatherings was thick with incense containing compounds that enhanced psychic sensitivity, allowing even non-psychers to perceive the warp energies flowing through the Warmaster. During these court sessions, Horus would receive reports from his commanders, issue directives for upcoming campaigns, and adjudicate disputes between factions within his coalition. His decisions, delivered with the absolute authority of one favored by the dark gods, were binding even on his brother Primarchs. When Fulgrim and Perturabo nearly came to blows over the allocation of siege equipment for their respective operations, Horus's intervention ended the dispute instantly, not through compromise, but through a display of power that reminded both Primarchs of the consequences of defying his will. The creation of Lupercal's court coincided with a strategic shift in the traitor's approach to warp manipulation. Where earlier efforts had focused on creating generalized storms to isolate Terra, Horus now directed his sorcerers to craft a more sophisticated phenomenon, the Ruin Storm. This massive warp disturbance was not merely a barrier, but an actively malevolent entity, a semi-sentient storm that hunted loyalist vessels while allowing traitor ships to navigate its currents with relative safety. The Ruinstorm's creation represented one of the most ambitious applications of warpcraft in human history. Under Lorgar's direction, Wordbearer's sorcerers established ritual sites on 50 worlds, forming a rough sphere around the Segmentum Solar. At a precisely calculated moment, determined by astrological alignments and warp current patterns, simultaneous sacrifices were conducted on each world. The victims, numbering in the billions, died not merely from physical trauma, but from carefully orchestrated psychic assaults that maximized their terror and despair. The resulting psychic shockwave tore a wound in reality that expanded outward, engulfing entire sectors in warp energy that defied conventional navigation. Astropathic communications through the affected regions became impossible, with messages either failing to penetrate the storm or arriving so corrupted as to be worse than useless. Navigators attempting to plot courses through the Ruin Storm reported impossible phenomena, stars that screamed, currents that flowed in closed loops, and predatory entities that hunted ships through the Imperium with malevolent intelligence. For loyalist forces caught within the Ruin Storm's influence, the effects were devastating. The Ultramarines, largest of the Space Marine legions, found themselves trapped in the 500 worlds of Ultramar, unable to bring their considerable strength to Terra's defense. The Dark Angels, returning from campaigns in the Eastern Fringe, were forced into desperate detours that cost precious time and resources. The Space Wolves, having survived the treachery at Prospero, struggled to navigate a path through the storm that would not lead to their destruction. Horus's manipulation of warp travel extended beyond the Ruin Storm to more targeted applications. Working with the Thousand Suns sorcerers who had joined his cause after the burning of Prospero, the Warmaster developed techniques for creating temporary corridors through the warp that allowed his forces to bypass loyalist defensive positions. These passages, stabilized through continuous sacrifice aboard dedicated ritual ships, enabled traitor fleets to appear in systems where conventional strategic analysis indicated they could not possibly reach. This capability proved decisive during the Battle of Pluto, the first engagement in the solar system. Loyalist commanders had established a defensive perimeter extending from the Kuiper Belt inward, with overlapping fields of fire designed to bleed traitor forces before they could approach the inner planets. Rogel Dorn's calculations, based on known warp routes and translation capabilities, indicated that the traitors would be forced to emerge at one of 7 possible locations, all covered by substantial defensive assets. Instead, Horus's fleet translated directly into orbit around Pluto, bypassing the outer detection grid entirely. The Loyalist forces stationed there, unprepared for an assault from such an unexpected vector, were overwhelmed before they could reorganize their defenses. With Pluto secured, the traitors gained a foothold in the solar system from which they could launch further attacks inward toward Terra. The final phase of Horus's preparation for the assault on Terra took place at Ulanor, site of his greatest triumph during the Great Crusade. The Warmaster deliberately chose this location for its symbolic significance. The place where the Emperor had named him Warmaster would now serve as the launching point for the final campaign to overthrow his father. The gathering of traitor forces at Ulanor represented the largest concentration of chaos-aligned power in human history, an assembly of military might and warp energy that distorted reality for light years in all directions. The muster at Ulanor allowed Horus to personally inspect the forces that would participate in the siege of Terra. The traitor legions presented their strength for the Warmaster's approval, each trying to outdo the others in displays of martial prowess and devotion to the ruinous powers. The Sons of Horus, as the Warmaster's own legion, took pride of place, their companies arrayed in perfect formation across the plains where the Emperor had once stood. The World Eaters, now fully in the grip of Khorne's battle lust, performed blood rituals that left the ground saturated with gore. The Emperor's children, transformed by their devotion to Slaanesh, presented displays of martial perfection that bordered on performance art, each movement calculated to maximize both lethality and aesthetic impact. Beyond the Astartes legions, the full extent of Horus's coalition became apparent. Dark Mechanicum war machines towered over the assembled troops, their forms no longer adhering to the clean lines of Imperial technology, but incorporating organic components and warp-infused mechanisms. Titan legions that had turned against the Imperium presented their god machines, now twisted by exposure to the warp into configurations that defied both physics and sanity. Most numerous were the human troops, Imperial army regiments that had followed their officers into rebellion, planetary defense forces from worlds that had embraced the Warmaster's cause, and cultists drawn by the promise of power from the dark gods. The scale of this gathering served practical purposes beyond mere display. It allowed Horus to standardize equipment and communication protocols across his disparate forces, ensuring they could function as a coherent whole during the complex operations required to breach Terra's defenses. Specialized munitions developed by the Dark Mechanicum were distributed according to tactical requirements, with priority given to formations assigned to neutralize specific Imperial fortifications. Command structures were formalized, with clear chains of authority established to prevent the confusion that had hampered earlier combined operations. Most importantly, the gathering at Ulanor allowed Horus to imprint his will upon the assembled forces through both conventional and psychic means. The Warmaster addressed his troops from a massive podium constructed from the wreckage of Loyalist vessels, his voice amplified by technology and warpcraft to reach even the furthest ranks. As he spoke, those in attendance reported a sensation of the Warmaster's consciousness touching their minds directly, creating a connection that transcended language and implanted his strategic vision directly into their thoughts. This psychic imprinting ensured that even when communications failed during the chaos of battle, traitor forces would continue to function according to Horus's grand design. Unit commanders found themselves instinctively making decisions that aligned with the overall strategy, even without explicit orders. This advantage would prove crucial during the siege of Terra, where conventional command and control systems frequently collapsed under the strain of continuous combat and warp interference. The final element of Horus's preparation involved securing his position as the chosen vessel of Chaos Undivided. While each of the four Chaos gods had their own champions among the Primarchs, Angron for Khorne, Fulgrim for Slaanesh, Mortarion for Nurgle, and Magnus for Tzeentch, Horus alone enjoyed the favor of all four powers simultaneously. This unique status granted him capabilities beyond even his brother Primarchs, but came with the challenge of balancing the competing demands of entities that were, by their nature, opposed to one another. To maintain this balance, Horus engaged in elaborate rituals designed to pay homage to each god while preventing any single power from gaining dominance over him. These ceremonies, conducted in a specially constructed chamber aboard the Vengeful Spirit, involved sacrifices tailored to each deity's preferences: bloodletting for Khorne, sensory manipulation for Slaanesh, induced disease for Nurgle, and complex manipulations of probability for Tzeentch. The precise details of these rituals remain unknown, as all mortal witnesses were invariably sacrificed as part of the proceedings. The results of these rituals manifested in Horus's growing godlike powers. The Warmaster developed the ability to perceive multiple possible futures simultaneously, allowing him to select optimal strategic paths with near-perfect accuracy. His physical capabilities expanded beyond even Primarch standards, with documented instances of him moving faster than Astartes targeting systems could track and absorbing firepower that would have destroyed armored vehicles. Most significantly, he gained the ability to directly manipulate the thoughts and emotions of those around him, bending even strong-willed individuals to his purpose through psychic dominance. As the final preparations for the assault on Terra neared completion, Horus gathered his inner circle for a strategic council that would set the parameters for the coming siege. Each Primarch presented their assessment of Terra's defenses and their proposed approach to overcoming them. Perturabo, with his unmatched expertise in siegecraft, outlined the vulnerabilities in Dorne's fortifications and the sequence in which they should be attacked. Mortarion detailed the biological and chemical weapons his Death Guard had developed to overcome the Defenders' transhuman physiologies. Fulgrim and Angron, now fully demonic, offered less practical counsel, but promised unstoppable assault forces when the walls were finally breached. Throughout these presentations, Horus remained silent, absorbing the information while communing with the warp entities that now formed part of his consciousness. When all had spoken, the Warmaster rose and approached a hololithic display of Terra's defenses. With a gesture, he altered the projection, revealing aspects of the fortifications that even Perturabo's detailed analysis had missed. Speaking in a voice that resonated with warp energies, Horus laid out a comprehensive plan that incorporated elements from each Primarch's proposal while transcending them all. The strategy he outlined was not merely a military operation, but a multi-layered assault on reality itself. Conventional forces would engage the physical defenses, keeping the Loyalists occupied, while specialized units targeted psychic weak points in the fabric of reality around the Imperial Palace. The ultimate objective was not simply to kill the Emperor, but to corrupt the Astronomicon and transform it into a beacon of chaos that would expose the entire galaxy to the unfiltered power of the warp. The Solar War began not with a thunderous declaration, but with calculated precision. Horus's armada emerged from the warp at carefully plotted coordinates throughout the outer solar system, bypassing the most heavily fortified approach vectors. The Warmaster had spent months studying the defensive grid established by Rogel Dorn, identifying subtle weaknesses in the seemingly impenetrable network of void fortresses, minefields, and patrol routes. Rather than confronting these defenses head-on, Horus opted for infiltration and subversion. The first phase of the Solar War targeted the communications infrastructure linking the defensive outposts. Alpha Legion operatives, inserted years earlier during routine personnel rotations, activated sleeper cells throughout the system. These agents simultaneously disabled astropathic relay stations on Pluto, Neptune's moon Triton, and several key monitoring outposts in the Kuiper Belt. With these nodes silenced, entire sectors of the defensive grid were effectively blinded, creating corridors through which the main traitor fleet could advance undetected. Horus personally oversaw the Void Battle for Jupiter and its moons, recognizing the gas giant's strategic importance as both a resource hub and the final significant obstacle before Mars and Terra. The Jovian shipyards, constructed during the early days of the Great Crusade, represented one of the largest concentration of military production facilities in the Segmentum Solar. If captured intact, they would provide the traitor forces with repair and resupply capabilities vital for sustaining a prolonged siege. The battle for the Jovian system demonstrated Horus's tactical brilliance even as it revealed the depths of his corruption. The Warmaster deployed the Death Guard against the orbital defenses of Ganymede, knowing that Mortarian's sons could withstand the radiation weapons that formed the moon's primary defense. Simultaneously, Emperor's Children's Strike Forces targeted the administrative centers on Callisto, their enhanced sensory capabilities allowing them to navigate the moon's perpetual storms with unnatural precision. Most decisive was Horus's use of the Sons of Horus in a direct assault on the main shipyards. The Warmaster led this attack personally, his flagship Vengeful Spirit breaking through the defensive screen through a combination of void warfare excellence and warp-enhanced capabilities. Witnesses reported reality itself seeming to bend around the massive vessel, with lance strikes dissipating harmlessly into pocket dimensions and torpedoes veering off course, as though repelled by unseen forces. When Loyalist reinforcements attempted to counterattack, they found themselves engaged by World Eaters boarding parties that materialized within their vessels through means that defied conventional understanding of teleportation technology. These boarding actions were characterized by extreme brutality, even by the standards of void warfare, with World Eaters berserkers slaughtering entire bridge crews and engineering sections before returning to their own vessels, leaving the Loyalist ships drifting and vulnerable. With the Jovian system secured, Horus established his forward headquarters on Ganymede and began detailed planning for the approach to Terra. The Warmaster recognized that the inner system presented challenges different from the outer system campaign, where the defenses of the outer planets had been primarily void-based and relatively isolated from each other. The inner system featured interlocking fields of fire and overlapping patrol zones that would prevent the piecemeal approach that had proven so effective thus far. Horus's solution demonstrated his comprehensive understanding of Imperial military doctrine. Rather than attempting to defeat these defenses through conventional means, he opted to overload them through simultaneous attacks across multiple vectors. The traitor fleet split into 5 major battle groups, each targeting a different approach to Terra. This forced the Loyalist defenders to spread their resources thin, unable to concentrate sufficient firepower to decisively repel any single thrust. The most audacious element of this strategy involved the use of Mars itself. The fabricator General Kelber Hal, who had thrown his support behind Horus early in the Heresy, activated dormant scrap code throughout the Loyalist defensive systems. This digital contagion, implanted years earlier during routine maintenance cycles, caused catastrophic failures in targeting arrays, life support systems, and communication networks at precisely the moment when the traitor fleet made its final push toward Terra. As the traitor armada closed on Terra, Horus meticulously assigned specific sectors of the Imperial Palace to each traitor legion based on their particular strengths and the nature of the defenses they would face. This allocation was not merely tactical but psychological, designed to maximize both military effectiveness and the symbolic impact of each engagement. The Iron Warriors under Perdurabo were tasked with breaching the Helios Gate, the massive fortification that protected the palace's eastern approach. This assignment played to the 4th Legion's unmatched expertise in siege warfare, while satisfying Perdurabo's desire to prove his superiority over Rogel Dorn, whose Imperial fists had constructed the very defenses he would now dismantle. Perdurabo approached this challenge with characteristic methodical precision. Rather than a frontal assault on the gate itself, he established a series of firing positions on the surrounding highlands, each precisely calculated to provide interlocking fields of fire that would systematically eliminate defensive emplacements. Massive siege engines, constructed in the forges of Olympia and modified by Dark Mechanicum adepts, deployed shells containing specialized munitions, some delivering conventional explosives, others releasing alchemical compounds that weakened ferrocrete at the molecular level, and still others containing warp entities that phased through physical barriers to attack defenders directly. The World Eaters under Angron, now fully transformed into a demon Primarch of Khorne, were directed against the Eternity Wall spaceport. This assignment recognized both the 12th Legion's unmatched ferocity in close-quarters combat and the strategic importance of the spaceport as a potential landing zone for Loyalist reinforcements. Angron's approach contrasted sharply with Perturabo's calculated bombardment. Waves of berserkers hurled themselves against the defenses with no regard for casualties, their only objective to reach combat range, where their chain axes and gladius blades could find purchase in Loyalist flesh. The Death Guard under Mortarion focused on the Saturnine Gate, employing a combination of overwhelming resilience and biological warfare that typified their transformed nature. Plague Marines advanced through zones saturated with radiation and chemical weapons that would have killed even Astartes of other legions, their corrupted physiologies not merely surviving these conditions, but thriving in them. Behind this advance came specialized units deploying plague spores that transformed the environment itself into a weapon against the defenders, with every surface becoming host to virulent contagions engineered by Mortarion himself. The Emperor's children, having fully embraced the excesses of Slaanesh, were assigned to the Palatine district, where the administrative heart of the Imperium was located. Their approach combined military precision with theatrical cruelty, each advance accompanied by sonic weapons that broke both physical structures and the minds of defenders. Fulgrim personally led assaults against key objectives, his demonic form moving with impossible grace through the heaviest fire, his blades finding vulnerabilities in even the most heavily armored opponents. Horus reserved the Sons of Horus for the most critical sectors, deploying them as a strategic reserve that could reinforce success or shore up potential breakthroughs. The 16th Legion operated as the Warmaster's direct instrument, their movements coordinated with his overall battle plan in ways that other legions, increasingly focused on their patron gods' agendas, could not match. Veteran companies led by 1st Captain Abaddon targeted command and control nodes, eliminating Loyalist officers whose leadership might have organized effective counterattacks. Throughout the initial phase of the siege, Horus remained aboard the Vengeful Spirit in orbit, directing the overall flow of battle while conserving his energy for what he knew would be the final confrontation. From this vantage point, he could observe the entire battlefield, his warp-enhanced senses perceiving not just physical movements, but the ebb and flow of psychic energies as the defender's resolve was tested against the relentless pressure of his forces. This detachment allowed Horus to make dispassionate adjustments to his strategy as the siege progressed. When the Death Guard's advance against the Saturnine Gate stalled due to unexpectedly effective countermeasures by White Scar's fast attack units, Horus redirected elements of the Iron Warriors to provide supporting fire. When the Emperor's children became distracted by the opportunities for excess presented by captured civilian populations, the Warmaster dispatched Sons of Horus disciplinary units to refocus them on military objectives. As the siege entered its second month, Horus became increasingly aware of a critical time constraint. Intelligence reports indicated that Loyalist reinforcements, including the Ultramarines, Space Wolves, and Dark Angels, had found ways to navigate through the warp storms and were making progress toward Terra. If these forces arrived before the palace fell, the balance of power would shift decisively against the traitors. This realization prompted Horus to accelerate his timetable, taking greater risks to achieve a breakthrough. The most significant of these calculated gambles involved the deployment of Titans from the corrupted Legio Mortis directly against the Eternity Wall, despite the exposed approach that left these massive war machines vulnerable to defensive fire. The psychological impact of these god engines, now twisted by warp influence into configurations that defied rational understanding, proved worth the risk, as entire sectors of the defense line broke under the mental strain of facing such abominations. As pressure mounted, Horus made the fateful decision to lower the void shields of the Vengeful Spirit, creating a deliberate vulnerability that he believed would force the Emperor's hand. This move represented both supreme confidence and desperate calculation. By presenting an apparent opportunity for a decapitation strike against the traitor leadership, Horus hoped to lure the Emperor away from the relative safety of the inner palace into a confrontation on terms favorable to the Warmaster. The decision was not made lightly. Horus understood that facing the Emperor directly entailed enormous risk, even with the power granted him by the Chaos Gods. The Master of Mankind remained the most potent psychic entity in the human experience, his capabilities far exceeding even those of the enhanced Warmaster. Yet Horus calculated that the Emperor's emotional connection to his sons, the same paternal sentiment that the Warmaster himself had once valued, would create exploitable weaknesses in a direct confrontation. The bait was taken, though not precisely as Horus had anticipated. Rather than the Emperor alone, it was a strike force led by Sanguinius, Primarch of the Blood Angels, that first teleported aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The Angel had recognized the opportunity presented by the lowered void shields, but insisted on leading the assault himself, both to assess the situation, and because he alone among the loyalist Primarchs present had the aerial mobility to navigate the massive flagship's interior spaces effectively. Sanguinius's arrival on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit set the stage for one of the most tragic confrontations of the heresy. The Angel, perhaps the most noble of the Emperor's sons, faced the Warmaster, now the embodiment of chaos undivided. Their meeting represented the clash of diametrically opposed philosophies, Sanguinius's selfless dedication to humanity against Horus's ambition and self-interest elevated to cosmic proportions. The duel between these brothers was brief but cataclysmic. Sanguinius, though a peerless warrior whose combat prowess was legendary even among the Primarchs, found himself facing an entity that had transcended the limitations of physical form. Horus moved with impossible speed, his strikes empowered by warp energies that could shear through even a Primarch's armor and flesh. More devastating than these physical attacks was the psychic assault that accompanied them. Horus projected visions of apocalyptic futures directly into Sanguinius's mind, showing him the fall of the Imperium and the extinction of humanity. Despite this onslaught, Sanguinius fought with the determination that characterized his legion, landing blows that would have felled any lesser opponent. For a brief moment, it appeared the Angel might accomplish what many thought impossible, the defeat of the Warmaster at the height of his power. Sanguinius's spear pierced Horus's armor at the shoulder joint, drawing ichor that hissed and burned where it touched the deck plating. This minor success proved short-lived. Horus, drawing deeply on the power granted him by the Chaos Gods, unleashed a concentrated burst of warp energy that stunned Sanguinius momentarily, just long enough for the Warmaster to seize his brother by the throat. With a single contemptuous motion, Horus broke the Angel's neck, ending the life of perhaps the most beloved of the Emperor's sons. The death of Sanguinius reverberated through the warp in ways that would have consequences far beyond the immediate strategic situation. Throughout the galaxy, Blood Angels Astartes experienced a psychic backlash that manifested as overwhelming rage and bloodlust, the first occurrence of what would later be known as the Black Rage. On Terra itself, the psychic shockwave reached the Emperor in his sanctum, providing unmistakable confirmation that Horus had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. With Sanguinius's broken body at his feet, Horus prepared for the confrontation he had engineered, the direct battle with the Emperor that would determine the fate of humanity. The Warmaster positioned himself in the stratagem of the Vengeful Spirit, a chamber whose dimensions had been subtly altered through warp craft to provide advantages to one attuned to the ruinous powers. Around him, reality itself seemed to warp and distort, the boundaries between material space and the immaterium growing thin in anticipation of the clash between the two most powerful beings in human experience. The Emperor's arrival on the Vengeful Spirit marked the culmination of Horus's grand rebellion. The Master of Mankind teleported aboard with a small contingent of elite warriors, custodians whose golden armor seemed to radiate light in the corrupted darkness of the flagship, along with several members of the Legio Custodes, and a cadre of Sisters of Silence whose null presence created pockets of stability in the warp-saturated environment. The teleportation itself was imperfect, a result of the warp distortions surrounding the vessel. The Emperor arrived alone in the antechamber to the Stratagem, separated from his honor guard by the vagaries of warp displacement. This isolation was precisely what Horus had anticipated, the opportunity to face his creator without interference, in an environment he had carefully prepared to maximize his advantages. As the Emperor moved through the corrupted corridors of the once proud Imperial vessel, the physical environment responded to his presence. Surfaces that had become organic and pulsing under chaos influence temporarily reverted to their original form, the psychic radiance of the Master of Mankind briefly overwhelming the taint that had seeped into the very structure of the ship. Yet this cleansing effect extended only a few meters in any direction, and as the Emperor passed, the corruption flowed back like a tide, more virulent than before. The confrontation began the moment the Emperor entered the Stratagem. Horus stood waiting, his massive form silhouetted against the tactical displays showing the battle for Terra raging below. The Warmaster's armor, once a proud example of artifice created to honor the greatest of the Emperor's generals, had transformed into something that strained the eye and mind to comprehend. Its surfaces rippled with barely contained energies, and symbols etched into the ceramic seemed to move when not directly observed. What transpired next has been the subject of intense debate and mythologizing for 10,000 years. No mortal witnesses survived to provide a first-hand account, and the psychic turbulence generated by the confrontation rendered even technological recording devices unreliable. What is known with certainty is that the duel between creator and creation was fought on multiple levels simultaneously: physical, psychic, and symbolic. The physical combat demonstrated transhuman capability pushed to its absolute limit. Horus, empowered by the combined might of the Chaos Gods, moved with impossible speed and struck with force that could shatter mountains. The Emperor, though physically smaller than his creation, countered with techniques perfected over millennia of warfare, his movements precise and economical where Horus's were overwhelming and brutal. More significant than this physical exchange was the psychic battle that accompanied it. The Emperor unleashed the full measure of his psychic might, powers that had been carefully restrained throughout the Great Crusade to avoid terrifying the very humans he sought to unite. Golden flames of pure psychic energy engulfed his form, and where this energy touched the corrupted deck plating, reality itself was scoured clean of chaos influence. Horus countered with the combined psychic weight of the ruinous powers flowing through him. Darkness that devoured light, impossible geometries that strained sanity, and sounds that existed outside the range of human perception, all manifested as weapons in this immaterial conflict. The clash of these opposing forces created reality distortions throughout the vessel, with crew members and Astartes far from the Stratagem experiencing temporal anomalies, spontaneous mutation, and in some cases, complete molecular dissolution as the laws of physics buckled under the strain. The symbolic dimension of the battle may have been the most significant, though least visible to conventional perception. The Emperor and Horus represented diametrically opposed visions for humanity's future, the Master of Mankind fighting for a galaxy where humans would eventually evolve beyond their physical limitations into a psychically mature species, while the Warmaster had embraced a path of surrender to the very entities that predated on human consciousness. This philosophical conflict manifested in the warp as competing narratives that sought dominance not just over each other, but over the collective unconscious of humanity itself. The outcome would determine which story would shape the species' development for millennia to come: ascension through discipline and sacrifice, or power through submission to darker impulses. For a time, the battle appeared evenly matched. The Emperor's unmatched psychic might was counterbalanced by Horus's status as the vessel for four cosmic entities whose existence predated humanity itself. The Warmaster even gained a temporary advantage when he telepathically projected images of the loyalist forces faltering across Terra, suggesting that the Emperor's cause was already lost regardless of the outcome of their personal combat. The turning point came when Horus, overconfident in his newfound powers, made a critical miscalculation. Rather than continuing the direct assault on the Emperor, he chose to prolong the confrontation, savoring the opportunity to demonstrate his superiority over his creator. This moment of hubris manifested in a psychological attack. Horus temporarily lowered his psychic defenses to more fully project his corrupted consciousness into the Emperor's mind, intending to show him the futility of resistance against the inevitable dominance of chaos. This action created a momentary vulnerability that the Emperor, despite being physically wounded and psychically taxed, recognized immediately. Drawing on reserves of power that had remained untapped even in this desperate struggle, the Master of Mankind concentrated his entire being into a focused psychic spear that pierced Horus's momentarily exposed consciousness. What the Emperor found within his son's mind proved decisive. Beneath layers of corruption and demonic influence, a fragment of the original Horus remained, the loyal son who had once stood proudly at the Emperor's side, dedicated to the dream of human unification. This remnant, buried but not destroyed by the ruinous powers, responded to the Emperor's psychic touch with recognition and remorse. In that moment of connection, Horus experienced a moment of terrible clarity. The veil of lies and corruption parted, allowing him to perceive the true nature of the entities he had embraced as allies. He saw the Chaos Gods not as patrons offering legitimate alternative paths for humanity, but as predators who had used his ambition and resentment to turn him into a weapon against his own species. The enormity of his betrayal, not just of the Emperor, but of the human future he had once fought to secure, crashed upon him with the weight of galaxies. This moment of lucidity proved both redemptive and fatal for the Warmaster. The competing influences within him, the chaos, corruption, and his original loyalty, created a psychic conflict that momentarily paralyzed him physically. The Emperor, recognizing that this might be his only opportunity to end the confrontation decisively, gathered his remaining strength for a final assault. What happened next has become one of the most iconic moments in Imperial history, rendered in countless artworks and religious texts. The Emperor, his physical form grievously wounded from the battle, summoned a concentration of psychic energy that manifested as a sword of pure golden light. With this symbolic and literal weapon, he struck at Horus with the full measure of his power, no longer restrained by paternal sentiment or hope for redemption. The blow landed with physical, psychic, and symbolic force simultaneously. The Emperor's attack did not merely destroy Horus's physical form, but extended into the immaterial, severing the connections between the Warmaster's soul and the chaos entities that had empowered him. The psychic backlash from this separation rippled through the warp, momentarily disrupting the very storms that had isolated Terra and allowing navigators across the system to glimpse clear paths through the Imperium for the first time since the heresy began. As Horus fell, mortally wounded in body and soul, the Emperor stood over his fallen son. Imperial mythology describes a final exchange between them, though no records confirm what words, if any, passed between creator and creation in those last moments. What is documented is that Horus experienced a final moment of clarity before death claimed him, a brief window in which he was fully himself again, free from the corruption that had driven him to rebellion. This clarity brought no comfort, only the full realization of what he had done. Horus Lupercal, once the brightest star in the Emperor's firmament, died with the knowledge of his betrayal weighing on his soul. Whether this moment of recognition offered any possibility of redemption in the cosmic sense remains one of the great theological questions of the Imperial Creed, debated by scholars and priests for millennia afterward. The Emperor's victory came at catastrophic cost. The Master of Mankind had expended so much of his power in the final confrontation that his physical form was damaged beyond recovery. Only the intervention of Rogel Dorn, who finally fought his way to the Stratagem after the Emperor's custodian guard had been scattered throughout the vessel, prevented the complete loss of the Emperor's consciousness. Dorn found his father's broken body beside the corpse of Horus and the already cooling remains of Sanguinius, a tableau of tragedy that would define the Imperium's character for the next 10,000 years. In the aftermath of Horus's death, the traitor forces fell into disarray. The Chaos Gods, having lost their primary vessel in the material realm, withdrew much of the power they had been channeling into the assault on Terra. Without Horus's strategic genius and unifying presence, the traitor legions reverted to pursuing individual agendas, their coordination collapsing just as loyalist reinforcements began arriving in the solar system. The body of Horus became a contested prize in the chaotic retreat from Terra. Abaddon, first captain of the Sons of Horus and the Warmaster's most devoted follower, fought his way to his Primarch's corpse, determined that it would not be left for the Loyalists to desecrate. Leading a desperate boarding action against his own flagship, now partially reclaimed by Loyalist forces, Abaddon recovered Horus's remains and escaped with them aboard the battle barge Vengeful Spirit, breaking through the reforming Imperial blockade through a combination of void warfare excellence and desperate sacrifice. The Warmaster's body was subsequently enshrined on the planet of the Sorcerers, a demon world within the Eye of Terror that had become the refuge of the traitor legions following their defeat. There, preserved through a combination of stasis technology and warp craft, Horus's corpse became both a pilgrimage site for those still loyal to his memory and a point of contention among the increasingly fractious traitor forces. This uneasy situation persisted until the First Legion Wars erupted within the Eye of Terror. As the traitor legions turned on each other, competing for resources and the favor of their patron gods, the Emperor's children launched a raid against the Sons of Horus's stronghold. Led by Fabius Bile, the Emperor's children sought Horus's genetic material for their own corrupted experiments in Primarch replication. During this assault, Horus's body was stolen and subsequently destroyed by the Emperor's children in a final act of desecration. This loss shattered the already fragile cohesion of the Sons of Horus, sending them into a spiral of decline that would only be reversed years later when Abaddon formally rejected his Primarch's legacy, renamed the Legion the Black Legion, and declared himself the new architect of the long war against the Imperium. The legacy of Horus Lupercal in the 10 millennia since his fall exists as a study in contradictions. To the Imperium, he represents the archetypal traitor, his name synonymous with betrayal of the most profound kind. Imperial histories portray him as irredeemably corrupt, a cautionary tale of pride and ambition unchecked. In formal Imperial records, his name is literally blotted out, referred to only as the arch-traitor or the great enemy, his very identity deemed too dangerous to acknowledge. Yet among the forces of chaos, Horus's legacy is equally complex. He is simultaneously revered as the only being who ever came close to overthrowing the Corpse Emperor and criticized for his ultimate failure. The traitor legions who still fight the long war from within the Eye of Terror maintain divergent views on the Warmaster, some venerating him as a visionary who recognized the true path for humanity's evolution, others dismissing him as a tool who failed to recognize he was being used by powers beyond his comprehension. Perhaps most poignant is Horus's legacy within the Black Legion itself. Abaddon, in renaming the Sons of Horus and taking up the mantle of Warmaster, explicitly rejected his Primarch's failure while implicitly carrying forward his ambition. The Black Legion's repeated Black Crusades against the Imperium represent both a continuation of Horus's war and a repudiation of his methods, Abaddon seeking to succeed where his Gene Father failed, but determined to do so through his own strength rather than as a vessel for powers he cannot control. In the final analysis, Horus Lupercal represents the most tragic figure in humanity's long and troubled history, a being of limitless potential whose fall from grace precipitated 10,000 years of darkness. The brightest star in the Emperor's firmament became the black hole that nearly devoured the Imperium, and in his wake, he left a galaxy permanently scarred by his ambition. His story serves as an eternal reminder that even the greatest among us carry the seeds of their own destruction, and that the line between hero and villain may be as thin as a moment of weakness or a single fateful choice.